The second experiment, and it's a terrible one, is the Milgram experiment. So Milgram conducted an experiment where a man in a white coat, like me, invited volunteers, ultimately delivering lethal shocks simply because they were told to. If you don't understand that people obey, that obedience is at the root, then you can't grasp how torture and deportation can happen. Because when you resist obedience, you're threatened with everything.
Trust the science. This was the dogma of Anthony Fauci that quickly became the subject of mockery and derision. But for the vast majority of people is a foregone conclusion. We trust science every day with the prescriptions and the advice of doctors that we take, simply because very few people possess the time, energy, or ability to investigate for themselves why and how things as complex as medicine work. But the COVID era was an exception. A novel virus that had no clear treatment meant that the scientists, the experts, were only slightly more informed than the average person. Conflicting messaging about the efficacy of face masks, vaccines, and medicines, pervasive on a daily basis in that time frame, are likely a major contributing factor in the trust that people report having in scientists, subsequently falling. With a 2024 Pew report finding that, from its peak shortly after the start of the pandemic, 49% of Americans had a fair amount of faith in scientists, and 38% reported having a great deal of faith. Only 12% of those polled said they had little to no faith, but by October of 2023, this sentiment reached a low point, with 50% of Americans reporting a fair amount of faith, but only 23% reporting a great deal of faith, while those with little to no faith doubled, reaching 23%. This was not isolated to the US, but instead was a global phenomenon. As in France, there was a precipitous drop early on in COVID, as the percentage of people who reported believing that doctors are dedicated people who work for the good of humanity fell from 86% in 2019 to 72.8% in 2020, according to polling from the French Interdisciplinary Scientific Research Network, CNRS. Of course, science is a method, not a religion, and as such, to have faith in it is an inherent contradiction, but people clearly do have faith in these institutions, and that faith was shaken during COVID. And while in the English-speaking world, the face of the faithful was Anthony Fauci, a divisive man accused of egregious, unethical medical misconduct, particularly involving animal testing, despised by as many people as those who quite literally sung his praises and worshipped at his altar of science. But France had a Fauci-esque figure of its own, largely unknown outside of the Francosphere, despite the key role that he played in one of the many sub-dramas that plagued the COVID years, the subject of hydroxychloroquine. That man, the French Fauci, is Didier Raoult, a man who reached untold fame only for his house of cards at the University Hospital of Aix-Marseille to come crumbling down in catastrophe, catching countless other doctors as well as celebrities and politicians in the wake of his career's collapse. This is the story of how one man's crusade for chloroquine, fueled not by Hippocratic compassion, nor even scientific curiosity, but rather egotism, cronyism, and greed, collapsed an entire cabal within the French medical system, revealing decades of duplicity, intellectual incest, medical misconduct, personal profiteering, and unethical research. This is the story of the French Fauci, the Mengele de Marseille, Didier Raoult. Beginning with how a single study on synthetic quinine, the tonic part of tonic water, shook the globe by looking into the many scandals surrounding COVID, hydroxychloroquine, and the microbiologist at the eye of this storm who became swept up in its tailwinds. A tale of COVID and chloroquine. But before we begin, I want to tell you about this video's sponsor, you, my supporters on Patreon and Subscribestar who graciously fund these videos and allow me to do these kinds of deep dives into topics of science, academia, and politics. Without you all, I absolutely could not do this, so I'm so thankful for your support, And if you enjoy the presentation that you're about to see, which is the product of a hell of a lot of time and effort, from the research and scripting all the way to the editing, all of which I do myself, for better or for worse, probably mostly for worse, then please consider leaving it a like and subscribing if you're not already subscribed. And if you really enjoyed the video, consider supporting me on Patreon or Subscribestar, because I'm terrible at promoting it, hence why I'm doing it here now, which is linked in the description below. This particular video actually sprang out of an earlier project that I began earlier this year to read every retracted COVID paper that suffered from serious ethical or methodological issues, and I instead found myself down this Raoult rabbit hole, which seemed to never end and never cease to get more and more scientifically scandalous. As such, this video will eventually have a companion piece that covers pretty much all of the other ethical and methodological COVID retractions of note as a sort of state of COVID exception peer review. Because, honestly, this isolated case was far too massive in scope, as you can probably see from the runtime, to not have its own dedicated video. So, once again, if you like what you see, consider checking out my Patreon or my Subscribestar, or consider becoming a channel member for access to unique channel emojis. Or if you'd like something a little bit more tangible, I've created a new design to accompany this video over on my merch store, which also just has a whole host of different designs related to topics that I've covered in the past, and just social science in general. I also just wanted to actually appear on camera for a minute to say hello. I'm not an AI, still, and also because I kind of wanted to show off this little caricature that I drew of Raoult, who has been angrily glaring at the back of my head for the past month or so while I was working on this. Because I think it's pretty accurate. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching and for all of your support. And so now, for real this time, let's get into this torrid topic. The tale of COVID and chloroquine. The story of Didier Raoult. Countless subjects of public, scientific, and political interest flooded the information landscape of the COVID era. One particular topic that concerned all three, public health, science, and politics, that remained a talking point in some circles for years, was the use of an 85-year-old medication largely known for the treatment of malaria, but also for autoimmune disorders such as rheumatoid arthritis and lupus, and its possible application for the treatment of COVID-19. Chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine? Chloroquine is about as far removed from modern medicine as one can get, a synthetic with similar active mechanisms to those found in quinine, an amine originally identified in the bark of the quina tree, native to the Andes region. Quinine was sold in Europe by the mid-17th century as a treatment for malaria, under the name Jesuit's powder, having been identified and brought back to the Old World from the New, largely by Jesuit missionaries. Over time, the additive became so commonplace that it made its way into one of the world's most popular cocktails, the gin and tonic. After the First World War, a synthetic alternative to quinine, chloroquine, was developed in Germany, and today is one of the most widely available and cheapest drugs on the market, alongside the likes of penicillin. Early on in the COVID pandemic, the effectiveness of this reliable drug was fervently debated. As it would turn out, the winner of said debate was those more against its use, relegating its proponents to be included amongst the fringes of crackpot conspiracy theater, not because it is a particularly dangerous drug, it definitely can be dangerous, but again, its organic counterpart is the same as that of tonic water. And instead, it was abandoned because it was not particularly effective at treating COVID. However, the scientific story around the investigation of HCQ is a microcosmic exemplar of far broader-reaching ethical issues in academic inquiry, with both sides, for and against, forming marching lines. It is only now, with the clarity of hindsight, that we can really look back at these events for what they were, perhaps genuine attempts to curb a global pandemic and reduce mortality, but ultimately personal and political power grabs, for which science itself was little more than an afterthought. It is perhaps only because HCQ was dropped politically as a potential palliative, and its supporters publicly persecuted as pseudoscientists, that now, years after the pandemic, we are even able to unravel the web of sketchy science that surrounded this particular medicine. Again, one of the cheapest, most readily available drugs on Earth. Truly, the treatment of hydroxychloroquine by those both for and against it can serve to illustrate the state of exception, the unreality that was pervasive in the COVID years. So, let's examine the history of the COVID hydroxychloroquine scandals, a story so full of characters and dramatics and insanity that I don't doubt it may someday be fashioned into a feature film, filtered, of course, of all fact. It really is just that scandalous, as if the runtime of this video was not enough of an indicator in and of itself. Because HCQ and its supporters would longitudinally be made into the villains of this story, I want to begin instead with its designated winners, and their own controversies, those critical of HCQ's application during the COVID crisis, because ultimately, neither extreme side was correct. But beginning with the temporary victors, 2 articles, one published in The Lancet and another in the similarly esteemed New England Journal of Medicine, both of which presented results indicating dangers in the use of hydroxychloroquine and were cited frequently in political discussions surrounding COVID. As of 2025, both have been retracted due to their shared use of data sourced from a small, US-based healthcare analytics company, Surgisphere, whose CEO, Sapan Desai, co-authored the 2 papers. The Lancet study reported that of patients hospitalized with COVID, the control group, who received neither chloroquine nor hydroxychloroquine, had a mortality rate of 9.3%, while the mortality rate of those treated with hydroxychloroquine was nearly double that, 18% and 16% respectively. When combined with macrolide antibiotics, the mortality rate rose again to 23.8% and 22.2% respectively, well over twice as deadly as using no treatment at all. These findings were so disconcerting that they prompted the World Health Organization to temporarily pause research of the use of either drug in the treatment of COVID. Except, here's the thing. Those data from Surgisphere, used in these 2 major studies co-written by its CEO, were more than a bit suspect. Questions were immediately raised about the Lancet publication, as the authors did not use hierarchical modeling, nor report on the individual countries and hospitals that they drew data from, including presumably from countries such as the UK, where no private hospitals were treating COVID during the time of publication, and despite such NHS data not typically being made readily available to private firms, let alone without specification of their origin. In other words, they seemed to claim to have access to NHS data that they really could not have had access to. Further, the numbers just didn't add up, as the number of deaths reported in Australia from COVID was listed as 73 in the paper, but was, in reality, 67, according to Australian clinical databases. This led readers to ask, if not from such a database, then where did these data come from? Desai responded to the criticism by stating that data from an Asian hospital had been erroneously included in the Australian sample. But the real answer is that the data came from Surgisphere, a small, till then unknown firm that predominantly published medical guides and textbooks, and employed just 11 people, not one of whom had any experience in processing information from medical databases. The first author on both papers was cardiac surgeon Mandeep Mehra, a professor at Harvard and the author of over 200 academic papers with over 70,000 citations, whose name lent enough credibility to the articles to earn them a place in 2 prestigious journals. Mehra had previously been found to have taken money for his research from Triple Gene, a gene therapy company owned by one of the 3 medical professionals working at Surgisphere, fellow cardiac surgeon and relative by marriage of Desai, Amit Patel. 2 employees at Surgisphere had 0 background in medicine at all, including a science editor whose regular job is science fiction writing, and a marketing executive who otherwise works as an adult model, and most of whom had joined the company mere weeks before the publication of these quite literally world-changing findings, meaning that even if Surgisphere was staffed entirely by medical data experts, they would not have had the time necessary to conduct such a detailed analysis. In total, 17 papers had been found to have used Surgisphere data, including 3 hydroxychloroquine papers. 13 were based on personal reports from Desai's surgical practice, from which he was facing 2 ongoing malpractice lawsuits, leading to the inactivation of his medical license after the publication. And the additional study, first authored by Desai, was, ironically enough, a paper discussing the conflicts of interest for medical publishers and editors, emphasizing the need to protect the integrity of scientific scholarship.
In the business, we call this foreshadowing.
Similarly, ironically, in the About section of Sergey Sphere's since-deleted website, the group prides themselves on their scientific scholarship and pursuit of the truth, while also offering a COVID mortality calculator that touted its use of advanced machine learning algorithms, but in reality just divided the user's age by 20 and rounded up to the closest percentage point, similar to how one calculates sanity in Cthulhu. Desai founded Sergey Sphere as a medical student in 2007, and soon after used the existence of the firm as a platform from which to launch his own medical journal, the Journal of Surgical Radiology, which, despite closing its doors in 2013, having been cited only 29 times by other scholars, was claimed to have 50,000 subscribers and nearly 1 million page views monthly, as per the Sergey Sphere website at the time of this incident, at least according to an article from Science magazine. Everything about Sergey Sphere and Desai was, in fact, suspect, to say the least. In the years since the scandal, which became known as LancetGate, in addition to the Sergey Sphere website being taken down, Desai's Wikipedia page was also deleted, along with an Indiegogo campaign that he launched to fund a project called Neurodynamics Flow, which he described as, quote, a next-generation human augmentation device that can help humans achieve what was never thought possible, unlock human creativity.
Now let's all agree to never be creative again.
With over a decade of research into fine-tuning the device, Flow's sophisticated microprocessor precisely stimulates various areas of the brain to create a higher level of function. This, and all associated media with the failed campaign to fund a space-age brain power headband that raised only $352 out of its $10,000 goal, was deleted. All seemingly in an attempt to hide as much information about Desai as possible. Despite the lasting impact that these studies had, if on nothing else, public perception of the dangers posed by chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine in the treatment of COVID. Dr. Meira has continued with his prolific career largely unscathed from his involvement, and went on to publish 8 additional papers on COVID after Sergey Sphere's exposure in 2020. Desai, on the other hand, lost at least one legal battle, owing a patient whose leg required amputation after undergoing surgery following a car crash that was performed by Desai, over $10 million in damages in 2023, and he received a formal citation from the State Medical Board of Ohio in that same year. When The Lancet, the most respected publication in medicine, must make retractions for such embarrassingly bunk articles, then you know things weren't exactly going great scientifically at any level during COVID. Regarding hydroxychloroquine, while the current scientific consensus is that the drug is largely ineffective at treating COVID, although it remains a life-saving medicine for the treatment of malaria, it is also not causally linked to significantly increased mortality risk, as falsely evidenced by Desai. And his influence is clear not only in the public discourse, but in the academic record itself, as after the exposure of Desai and Sergey Sphere, other articles about hydroxychloroquine came under increased scrutiny as well. For example, another study, Deaths Induced by Compassionate Use of Hydroxychloroquine During the COVID-19 Wave, an Estimate, a titillating title, was retracted due to issues with the reliability and choice of data from a known unreliable Belgian dataset, and because it assumed all patients were being treated the same pharmacologically with the drug, although this particular retraction was concluded to have not been the product of any fraud or ethical misconduct. It likely slipped by at first because it evidenced the prevailing dominant narrative about COVID and hydroxychloroquine at the time, that being that HCQ was dangerous and even deadly. But again, there were 2 sides surrounding the story of hydroxychloroquine and COVID, which was far from limited to the Sergey Sphere controversy, and ultimately, that singular debacle was small potatoes compared to the case of one of hydroxychloroquine's most ardent supporters, famed French microbiologist Didier Raoult. Raoult was, at one point, one of the most renowned doctors in France, and head of the acclaimed Institute of Marseille Foundation, IHU, of Aix-Marseille University, AMU, and in the years since the peak of his mass adoration as a scientific savior, has had hundreds upon hundreds of his papers put under the proverbial microscope over ethical and methodological concerns, all following just one of them being flagged for concern by fellow microbiologist Elizabeth Beek, the first domino in what would become the collapse of an entire cloistered scientific empire, and leading to the retraction or notice of concern applied to 263 of Raoult's papers, as of July of 2025, according to the Retraction Watch database. Before I describe the practical and political effects of this single study identified by Beek, which are extensive, let's begin by looking at the data absent the social scandal, and in terms of the results regarding hydroxychloroquine itself. The findings of Raoult's paper that Beek took umbrage with, hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin as a treatment for COVID-19, results of an open-label non-randomized clinical trial, pre-published on March 16th of 2020, were indicative that the drug, particularly in combination with azithromycin, increased recovery speed of COVID patients in terms of days needed to test negative on a PCR test. Obviously, this was great news, particularly so early on in the days of the pandemic that would go on to stretch into months and even years. COVID mortality could be dropped to next to nothing by simply administering this ubiquitously accessible malaria medication? Well, pandemic problem solved, and with a synthetic version of tonic water at that. Well, obviously things were not quite so simple. As were quinine to be the answer, the female population would have been left unscathed.
Can I get a vodka tonic, please? I'd like a vodka tonic, please. Vodka tonic, please. A sea of waiters and no one will take a drink order.
So, just what were the problems that Dr. Beek had with such resoundingly positive results? One thing you may quickly notice as we actually look at this study is the very small sample size, indicated by the letter N, which, while far from unusual alone, is far too small to make any definitive claims off of. But far more disconcerting to Dr. Beek was the discrepancy between the dates of the medical trial and the date of the paper's submission to the International Journal of Antimicrobial Agents. Raoult's group claimed that the study was conducted for 14 days, beginning on March the 6th of 2020, after obtaining approval from an ethics committee. However, the paper was submitted as a preprint on the 16th, only 10 days after the initiation of the experiment. How could a 14-day trial have been completed, a report written up, that report submitted for publication, and then accepted less than 24 hours later, all in the span of just 10 days at a maximum? Dr. Beek assumed that, given the charts in the paper stopped reporting on data after 6 days, that the researchers must have ended the experiment early and perhaps merely forgot to mention that in their haste of getting the study out during an international health crisis. But, as we will learn, sloppiness and disregard for the truth are a hallmark of not just Raoult, but the entire cabal of scientists and doctors that surrounded him. Another immediately evident issue, as per the paper's very title, is that patients were not randomly assigned to treatment and control groups, but were instead assigned to groups by the researchers seemingly arbitrarily. A lecture given just weeks before this study was conducted from Raoult, wherein he explicitly states that he does not adhere to the use of randomization in any cases, gives context for the lack of randomization in this particular study. Moreover, the measurements here were inconsistent, with some patients' data reporting on precise CT values, the amount of time it takes for a PCR test to return a positive result, while others were described only as COVID positive or negative. The control group contained several children and young adults under the age of 25, while the experimental group consisted entirely of adults 25 and older, making the two groups incomparable as the immune response to many diseases, including COVID, can be influenced by patient age. In another bizarre incongruency, the authors state in writing that no patients were under the age of 12, but their own chart indicates that 2 subjects were only 10 years old. Additionally, while the study started with 26 patients, it ended with but 20, and only reported on the full data for those remaining 20. So, what happened to the other 6? Well, 3 of them dropped out after being transferred to an ICU, presumably getting worse. Another 2 either stopped the treatment due to nausea or were discharged from the hospital, the latter presumably getting better, and the final patient in that group of 26 died. Those seem like important statistics to include, don't you think? And yet their data were excluded. Further, one of the co-authors on the paper, J.M. Rollane, was the editor of the journal that the study was published in, presenting a clear potential avenue for conflict of interest. It would take nearly 5 years until February of 2025 for this paper, along with many others that Dr. Raoult was involved with, to be retracted, despite Dr. Beek's early reservations about its methods, and resulted in the citation of this paper in more than 6,000 other academic publications, including citations in new research being published as recently as May and June of 2025, even after its retraction. Curiously, likely some of the same people within the scientific and journalistic communities championing the unmasking of Sergisphere for their junk research, denouncing the drug as dangerous, were simultaneously denouncing Dr. Beek for her criticisms of work demonstrating its efficacy. Not for the sake of science, clearly, but for the sake of politics. And it does seem, as we will investigate in great detail, that if nothing else, then certainly internal politics were involved in the case of Didier Raoult, as that first hydroxychloroquine azithromycin paper that rocked the world and soon caught the attention of Donald Trump went from submission through peer review to publication all within just 24 hours, as Dr. Beek revealed in her investigation. Normally, this process can take weeks or even months. Before we continue, I want to briefly discuss Raoult's parachute stance in the treatment of particularly novel infectious diseases that he mentioned in his lecture just prior to the publication of the HCQ azithromycin paper, because it concerns the issue of randomization, as he states here.
So, Jean-Christophe, I have already published here, I loved it, it is a gynecologist who published it, called the parachute paradigm. He says, we need to go back because we have never proven that the parachute was working. So there have to be volunteers who jump without parachutes to show that with parachutes we survive more often than without. So it hasn't been randomized, the parachute thing.
On one hand, I do agree with some of what Raoult is arguing for in his defense of the use of non-randomized trials, in that, yes, there are some ethical limitations that are put upon scientists that can slow progress to a snail's pace, which during a global health crisis could quite literally be the difference between life and death for hundreds, maybe thousands, maybe even millions of people. However, as annoying as they may be, the umbrage raised by Dr. Beek with his cohort's skirting of the rules that are there to avoid causing undue harm are also legitimate. As if a scientist gets to bend or break the rules in one scenario, then what trust can one place in the credibility of that scientist to not bend and break the rules whenever and wherever he sees so fit? Randomization isn't the only standard that Raoult does not believe is necessary, as he has also expressed skepticism regarding the issue of antibiotic-resistant strains of bacteria, describing them as a Shadoxian paradox, a reference to French cartoon characters with only 4 spaces for phonemes in their tiny limited brains, and suggesting that such bacteria be instead treated with other antibiotics. Hence perhaps his insistence that the solution to COVID was HCQ rather than other alternatives, including vaccination, despite also maintaining an anti-big pharma stance, at least publicly, which, as we will learn, is rather hypocritical of him given his own involvement with big pharma firms. But again, as it turned out, hydroxychloroquine was not a panacea for COVID, but nor was it worthy of the demonization it faced as a result of work on the opposite side of sloppy science. Whether or not Dr. Beek was motivated to dig into Raoult's work by politics or by pure pursuit of the truth, and given that she does this all of the time wherever she finds errors in research, my money's on the latter, what she uncovered in that work was clearly not a problem with 1 or even 2 papers. It was a problem with dozens, and later, hundreds of papers. And it wasn't the only problem facing the IHU director following the publication of his HCQ COVID research. The effects of Raoult's work with hydroxychloroquine were not limited directly to medicine, but also became nearly instantly politicized during the COVID era, and as such, the signal that the study's timeframe made no sense, its methodology was potentially unsound, and the publication was potentially cronyist were lost in the noise of the news cycle's COVID exception. Hydroxychloroquine had been dusted off and dragged out of its long-established uses, relegated largely to the treatment of malaria and lupus, which it never is, and was born again as the cheap, readily available, and easy answer to treating COVID-19. But it seems that conclusion was reached not so much by some fluke of the universe, but rather by intelligent, design. On February 11th of 2020, Raoult and his colleagues published a brief document, Chloroquine for the 2019 novel coronavirus SARS-CoV-2, suggesting the use of HCQ in the treatment of the recently identified novel coronavirus, indicating that very early on in the pandemic, before it had even spread outside of China, Raoult believed that HCQ was the answer. While in many cases such a suggestion from a leading microbiologist would be indicative of nothing more than that, just a suggestion, in this instance it may instead be indicative that Raoult and his colleagues had already decided that HCQ was the solution to COVID-19, as they state, quote, "If clinical data confirm the biological results, the novel coronavirus-associated disease will have become one of the simplest and cheapest to treat and prevent amongst infectious respiratory diseases," end quote. And they were determined to prove just that. A few weeks later, and presumably conducted as part of their small experimental study on HCQ and azithromycin, set to begin the following day, on March 4th of 2020, Raoult published a preprint review of extant literature on the use of in vitro HCQ, based largely on 2 papers out of China, suggesting that the medicine be more widely considered as a treatment for the novel coronavirus. But just what were those 2 Chinese publications that justified further investigation into the use of HCQ? Enough to spur on a hasty experimental study with disregard for some normal ethical protocols? Well, the first was a short letter reporting on a conference held in China on February 15th, where experts and members of the government agreed that chloroquine could be an effective treatment for COVID. The second paper was similarly not any sort of clinical study or trial in and of itself, but instead merely referenced that several clinical trials using chloroquine had been registered in China, many of which were ultimately closed or suspended by the time of the March 4 preprint publication, and the remaining trials were still only in the recruiting phase. As such, neither paper was a study, and neither provided any empirical evidence, yet had been used in this literature review to justify the initiation of experimental work on HCQ in humans with COVID in France. But you know what was available just later that week, on March the 10th? Had Raoult and his colleagues been even slightly more careful with their handling of this novel virus and its potential treatment? A randomized pilot study on HCQ in hospitalized COVID patients in China from Chen et al., 2020. This similarly small sample of 30 subjects found comparable results in terms of days of hospital stay duration in both groups treated with or without HCQ. However, they also reported that those administered HCQ tended to take longer to test negative on a PCR test, and one subject in the experimental group developed a severe reaction to the malaria drug. Although this study was published on the 10th, it was accepted on the 3rd, meaning that had Raoult's cohort been paying closer attention, they would have already known that pilot evidence indicated little positive effects on COVID recovery from treatment with HCQ. Given that Raoult claims to read 3 to 4 medical papers every day, it's difficult to imagine how this preprint escaped him.
In Paris, I just read a meta-analysis, because when one is in the field, in reality, of course, we know things a bit before others. I myself review 3 to 4 papers on COVID that are sent to me from all the journals in the world every day. So, if you like, I know everything that happens relatively early.
Regardless of Chen's findings, not even 10 days after the publication of the literature review and now a week into Raoult's experiment, on March 13th of 2020, blockchain investor James Todaro and attorney Greg Regano published a Google document also recommending further research be done on the potential efficacy of the cheap and reliable malaria drug for COVID, citing recent guidelines from China and South Korea, as well as Raoult's literature review. Less than a week after the Google Documents publication, on the 16th, Raoult's non-randomized clinical trial of HCQ and azithromycin was also made publicly available, and by the end of the week, was making major news headlines, with Regano appearing on Tucker Carlson's program on Fox News, misrepresenting the results and espousing the combination as being 100% effective at treating COVID.
And I'm here to report that as of this morning, about 5 o'clock this morning, a well-controlled, peer-reviewed study carried out by the most eminent infectious disease specialist in the world, Didier Raoult, MD, PhD, out of the south of France, in which he enrolled 40 patients, again, a well-controlled, peer-reviewed study that showed a 100% cure rate against coronavirus.
When that clearly was not the case, one participant in Raoult's extremely small sample died, and 5 others were removed from the study's findings after dropping out for unknown reasons, with some very likely getting worse. Tucker seems taken aback by the astonishing nature of the results that Regano was pitching to him, along with the directive to spread the word about HCQ as far and wide as possible.
Well, that's, remarkable. Of course, it's our job to be skeptical of all and any claims. However, I very much want to believe this, and I think we need, obviously, immediately to run it down. The federal government needs to find out if this is true, because if it is, that's the biggest news of this moment.
Thank you. Please disseminate it to the scientific community immediately.
Also on March 19th, an article titled "Chloroquine May Fight COVID-19 and Silicon Valley's Into It" by Adam Rogers was published in Wired magazine, which similarly touted HCQ as a miracle drug to curb the COVID pandemic, but also provided some more details left out of Regano's short appearance on Fox News. Namely that, behind the scenes, Raoult had been in communication with both Regano and Tadero, as well as retired biochemist Tom Broker, who asked that his name not be included as a co-author on the Google document. So, the businessmen supporting HCQ's use in COVID on the news were in direct communication with the scientist researching it. On March 21st, Donald Trump himself, an avid viewer of Fox News, tweeted out the incredible results of Raoult's study and in doing so, had followed Regano's instructions to viewers to spread the word of the wonder drug. It was perhaps for this exact reason that Raoult created his own Twitter account in March, instantly gaining thousands of followers and sitting at over 1 million as of 2025. Despite Trump's tweet, in October of 2020, when Trump was hospitalized with COVID, he was treated with remdesivir, not hydroxychloroquine. Something to keep in mind, as remdesivir will come up again. Trump was not the only world leader to be convinced by the news of Raoult's work on the efficacy of HCQ, as Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro not only encouraged use of the drug, but he recorded himself taking it while recovering from COVID in July of 2020, when the virus was reportedly killing hundreds of Brazilians a day. Similarly to Bolsonaro, 2 French Republicans, Yves Moraine and Christian Estrosi, also recorded themselves taking hydroxychloroquine. And it wasn't just them, as in France, several local Republican politicians would test positive for COVID early, including Guy Tessier, Valérie Boyer, and Yvonne Berland, the latter of whom is a personal friend of Raoult's. Right-wing former presidential candidate Philippe de Villers reported on a CNews panel on March 18th that he had tested positive for COVID and had made a full recovery after being treated by Raoult with a combination of HCQ and pastis, an anise-flavored liqueur.
As this is a special occasion and we've invented a new cocktail for ourselves, Pernod, Ouzo, marmalade and salt, I think we should think of a special name for it. What do you think?
What about the bloody awful?
On the opposite side of the aisle, on March 26th, left-wing politician and de facto head of the new Popular Front Party, as well as 2022 presidential candidate Jean-Luc Mélenchon, wrote a lengthy blog post in defense of Raoult, stating, quote, "Of course, I don't know the exact reasons why these people despise Didier Raoult, or why they feel the need to heap sarcasm and suspicion upon him. So, knowing that the caricature is merely a projection of his critics' hatred, I approached the matter with curiosity, and I was not disappointed. A phone call may not be much, but sometimes it's enough to form an impression of someone." Mélenchon was likely inspired to write this piece in reaction to the newfound criticism that Raoult was receiving. For, as the clinical trial drew headlines and support from presidents and politicians, so too did it attract skeptics. As on the 22nd of March, Funk Brenatoa and Salema published a comment in The Lancet criticizing the many flaws of the Sergey-Sphere study and hypothesized that using HCQ to treat COVID may indeed be hazardous. This article was later retracted and updated with corrections of its own in July. The following day, back on March 23rd, Dalley, Gates, and Morris published a statistical review of the paper in which they criticized a number of flaws, including the use of the 2 Chinese papers, again nothing more than consensus at a conference and plans for future study, as justification for the clinical trial, but also raised qualms with the lack of randomization and covariate adjusted analysis. inappropriate control groups, the dropping of patients, including the ones hospitalized or dead from the analysis, reliance on PCR positive-negative testing as the outcome variable, and the overstatement of the effectiveness of azithromycin. The first inklings of doubt in the validity of Raoult's experiment had begun within mere days of its publication and explosion in public interest. But he didn't allow that new attention to slow his work, as on March 27th, he published a similar experiment with Gautretadol in Travel Medicine and Infectious Disease. This study had a larger sample size of 80 patients, including follow-up with 6 patients from the previous study, and again, no control group that did not receive the combination treatment of HCQ and azithromycin. Another flagrant disregard for medical research ethics norms in its own right, but in accordance with Raoult's stance on parachute theory. Of this sample, 83% tested negative at day 7 and 93% at day 8, while cultures from patient respiratory samples were negative in 97.5% of patients at day 5. While a far smaller percentage of this sample had serious reactions to HCQ compared to the first experiment, one still died, and another needed to be transferred to the ICU. Without a control group to compare against, these findings are largely meaningless, but serve to illustrate the fervor with which Raoult was tackling the now global COVID crisis with hydroxychloroquine. Not everyone was so convinced by Raoult's early results, particularly in light of the Sergei scandal, leaving open questions about both the efficacy of HCQ in treating COVID and its potential harm to patients. And on March 21st, French Health Minister Olivier Véran tweeted that he had contacted the High Council of Public Health, quote, so as to analyze and propose within 48 hours a re-evaluation of prescription regulation of HCQ. But Raoult was adamant about addressing the pandemic both globally and at home, as the subjects for his second study were drawn from the IHU, after he announced on the 22nd of March that anyone who tested positive for COVID could receive HCQ treatment at the IHU. Many were so desperate for an answer to the novel virus that they lined up outside of the university hospital, hoping to be treated with hydroxychloroquine. It was perhaps also because of the international media coverage that Raoult was receiving at the time that French President Emmanuel Macron visited him on April 9th while the rest of the country was observing strict stay-at-home rules that went into place shortly after Raoult announced his treatment, and may have even been in some small part a response to his announcement, hoping to quell the masses from descending upon the university at Marseille. Because descend, they did. Not just regular people seeking a cure, but the rich and famous too. Amongst those who tested positive for COVID and sought out Raoult's wonder drug were Constance Benke, the CEO of Lagardère Radio, Claude Pedriel, the owner-manager of the Pedriel Group, which publishes several magazines including the French business outlet Challenges, philosopher Bernard-Henri Lévy, Laetitia Hallyday, the wife of late famous French singer Johnny Hallyday, and musician Michael Polnareff, yes, that Polnareff, actress Mylène Demongot, and actor Fabrice Lucchini, who even expressed interest in playing Raoult in a biopic about his life. Or at least he did in an interview with Direct 5 in September of 2020. He may have since changed his mind.
I called him yesterday saying, couldn't we? I don't have any initiatives. I'm not feeling well enough to have thousands of projects, but I said Didier Raoult. I'd love to play Didier Raoult. I'd really like it.
What do you like? I mean, what attracts you to his character?
It is his opposition to the court of public opinion. He is a quite normal voice in some ways, but he's impactful and strange at the same time. People hate him. We hear, you the know-it-alls, because people hate each other. It's a people who hate that has always existed. And Didier Raoult was not uninteresting maybe as a biopic.
Bernard Arnault, the owner of Louis Vuitton, even vowed to purchase medical equipment such as gloves and lab coats for the IHU.
And why are you wearing a leather lab coat?
Because unlike you, I'm cool. I drive fast late at night when I should be sleeping. But you wouldn't understand.
Raoult had become a celebrity himself almost overnight, or at least a celebrity to a far broader audience than that of the scientific community. His newfound fans got tattoos of his face, accompanied by the text "Made in Marseille," a bit ironic as Raoult was quite literally not made in Marseille, having been born in Senegal. But I digress. Football fans seemed to be particularly big supporters, as they hung banners in his honor and even started a petition for a portrait of Raoult to be painted on an idyllic seaside ledge in Marseille, which once bore the likeness of famous footballer Zinedine Zidane, but had since been left unoccupied. Retired footballer Eric Cantona also chimed in to show his support for Raoult, calling him his idol, attributing the discovery of COVID to him, and making other false statements about Raoult's past, all while denouncing his critics.
He did literature, left to join the Navy. His father studied medicine. Now he's one of the greatest researchers on microbes, viruses and all that. He discovered the COVID virus. He even gave his name to a virus. He's a phenomenon.
You know, Johnny the Parisian with all his fancy stuff, and council tire, pipe, coffee, whereas he looks straight out of Woodstock.
Obviously, go take something, but they call him a charlatan, who's one of the world's top expert researchers. A charlatan, but he's your idol. He's my idol, I'd say. He's my idol.
In addition to his instantaneously popular Twitter account, Facebook groups cropped up to celebrate the doctor and gained hundreds of thousands of followers overnight. Of course, it wasn't just media celebrities talking about Raoult, as politics were interchangeably intertwined with the COVID pandemic, and as such it was also politicians and global health organizations. In addition to meeting with President Macron, other French political figures from across party lines spoke out in support of Raoult, increasingly so as skepticism about his HCQ azithromycin study began to spread amongst the populace, alongside the virus itself. As on the 25th of May, the World Health Organization suspended all clinical trials using HCQ for the treatment of COVID. The following day, the French Council of Public Health officially recommended against the use of HCQ, citing the sugary sphere Lancet study as a basis for its decision. And on the 27th, the French government revoked emergency authorization for the use of HCQ in all but the most severe cases.
It specifically addressed the issue of hydroxychloroquine. The High Council recommends not using this treatment in the absence of recommendations, except for severe hospital cases based on joint medical decisions and under strict medical supervisions. Finally, the High Council excludes any prescription in the general population or for non-severe forms at this stage in the absence, it says, of any conclusive data,
sparking responses from across the political landscape. Left-wing former presidential candidate Ségolène Royal said on Europe 1 on the 31st of March that Véran had acted hastily in voicing his skepticism on the treatment of COVID with HCQ, and that it was not because of science, but rather a personal vendetta against Raoult that spurred on Véran's actions. While she also said she was not supportive of all of Raoult's behaviors, she maintained that he needed to be reintegrated into the wider scientific community, rather than ostracized. She also said definitively that Raoult was not running non-controlled experiments, when that was exactly what he was doing. Right-wing politician for the National Rally, Marine Le Pen, was an early proponent of HCQ and supported Raoult from those opposed to his treatment protocol within the French government, saying, quote, "I don't understand why Professor Raoult, who says that chloroquine is useful from the very first symptoms, specifically to prevent the worsening of certain cases, is met with a government response that says we're only going to use it for the most severe cases." And former right-wing president Nicolas Sarkozy said of Raoult several months later in September of 2020 that Raoult had been made into a scapegoat by that same French government.
The former president of the Republic, speaking today at the Entrepreneurs Forum in Bouches-du-Rhône, criticized the French tendency to always look for someone to blame.
In every crisis, we have to find scapegoats. It's a French disease. For me, the real enemy is COVID, not this or that doctor. And I'm thinking particularly of Professor Raoult. I don't understand why there's been so much hostility toward him. He's a man of real quality who did everything he could to treat his patients. Of course, he probably made mistakes, like we all do. Me first. But what I see is that in times of crisis, the so-called experts rush in to badmouth someone. We need a culprit, and so we pick him.
Founder of the centrist party Debout la France, Nicolas Dupont-Aignan, similarly blamed politics for Véran's position and the subsequent criticisms of Raoult, although he mentions that even his political opponents, namely centre-right Republican Philippe Douste-Blazy, were aligned with him in their opinion on Raoult in a video that he posted to Facebook on May 26, 2020.
I am not, contrary to what some say, a defender of Professor Raoult, but I do not accept this harassment, this state manipulation. What is it about? It's harassment by those who do not want this chloroquine treatment, which has shown results, to be used worldwide because they have economic and financial motives. That's the reality. What we're seeing here is a clash between government-sanctioned medicine, heavily influenced by financial interests, led by Olivier Véran, and on-the-ground medicine. But what is unacceptable is this campaign against a man who is a true credit to France, someone who has made us all proud. Because in this matter, what is serious is that the lives of the French people are caught between studies being thrown back and forth, and no one believes anyone anymore. And worse still, the government has chosen interests at the expense of the health of the French and to the detriment of Professor Raoult. Let's be cautious, but please stop this relentlessness against the only one who showed audacity and refused to resign in the face of this COVID-19.
Philippe Douste-Blazy is not just a politician. He is also a cardiologist and was a member of the board at the IHU. He quickly became one of Raoult's most ardent supporters in the media during the COVID pandemic, and he made an appearance on BFM TV on May 23rd to defend Raoult and the IHU in their advocacy for the use of HCQ in COVID.
It is 17.6% of people who were hospitalized for COVID died. At the IHU, the University Hospital Institute in Marseille, that figure is 2.5% per day. We all know that hydroxychloroquine is very dangerous. It is a medication that obviously is effective, but like any effective medication, has side effects. I am a cardiologist, so the side effects on the heart. So it can cause cardiac rhythm disturbances. This is why, especially those listening to us, should not self-prescribe hydroxychloroquine. It is extremely dangerous. So obviously it must be given right at the beginning. There was Didier Raoult's strength giving it early.
By the tail end of May, the decisions about what to do with HCQ and COVID were made for Raoult and everyone else studying it. And many people really did want to be treated with HCQ, as a public opinion survey from Odoxa, also published on the 25th, indicated that 6 out of 10 of those polled wanted the government to speed up and follow the chloroquine option without waiting for the results of ongoing clinical trials. The will of the people was not the path followed by the government, however, effectively ending Raoult's and the IHU's brief moment in the spotlight as the holders to the keys of curing the pandemic. But while it was the end of this short-lived chapter, it was only the beginning of a very tumultuous period for both Raoult and the IHU, as with that increased attention also came increased scrutiny. This was no longer about COVID and hydroxychloroquine, which was quickly identified as an ineffective treatment for COVID, with an experimental study being made available on June 5th of over 3,000 patients from Recovery, a UK-based group that conducts clinical trials on treatments for pneumonia, published by Hornby et al., found no increase in the speed of recovery nor decrease in ventilation or mortality in those treated with HCQ. Shortly afterwards, on June 15th, the US FDA also placed a restriction on the use of HCQ, previously allowed for under emergency authorization. But again, HCQ was no longer the story, as all of this was not Raoult's first brush with controversy, for, as it turns out, the IHU had been embroiled in row after row, controversy after controversy, since its very founding, since before its founding. So let's learn a little bit more about the Institute itself, and the series of scandals that long preceded COVID, by looking into the earlier issues faced by the now world-famous University Hospital Institute, Mediterranee Infection. On April 21st of 2020, the nonprofit news outlet Mediapart, known for its investigations into political, social, and in this case, scientific scandals, published an article that dug into the not-so-distant past of this suddenly internationally famous physician and found his history to be far from spotless. In January of 2018, as Pascal Pasquariello reports, the IHU ended its affiliation with the French Interdisciplinary Scientific Research Network, CNRS, and the French National Institute of Health and Medical Research, INSERM, after receiving poor performance evaluations from both bodies. Remember these names, as they will be important later. In the preceding January of 2017, France's High Council for the Evaluation of Research and Higher Education Teaching, HCERES, commissioned an investigation into the work conducted by the Research Unit for Emerging Tropical Infectious Disease, ERMITE, of which Raoult was the head. There were two sections of the ERMITE laboratory, MEPHI and Vitrome, which were all made into officially distinct units in 2018. According to the HCERES, the work produced by the latter, Vitrome, Vectors, Tropical and Mediterranean Infections, was, quote, exploratory-oriented, focusing on the discovery of new microbial forms, and it was difficult for the panel to see the scientific or epistemological benefits in the absence of further characterization that, for example, demonstrates pathogenicity. Regarding the former, MEPHI, the research unit for microbes, evolution, phylogenesis, infection, it seems focused on quantity over quality. As for the 1,153 papers produced by the department between 2011 and 2015, only 4 were defined as highly cited, indicating that the goals of the precursor to the IHU were less about solving medical problems and more about earning prestige. An anonymous former colleague told Mediapart that when he worked in the ERMITE lab in 2016, his explicit directive was to identify as many new bacteria as possible, because a, quote, new bacteria leads to a new publication, which both guarantees the reputation of the laboratory and money. And that overall, he had no interest in this work, describing it as, quote, quantitative, for show, and lucrative. A report from 2017 obtained by Mediapart from members of various hygiene, safety, and working conditions committees, CHSCTs, from the 4 organizations directly involved with ERMITE's work, the CNRS, INSERM, the University of Aix-Marseille, and the Institute for Research and Development, IRD, was even more damning in its findings regarding the unit. The committee members found that the IHU laboratory staff regularly manipulated, quote, pathogenic biological agents in non-reglementary premises, including experimentation under defective air extractors, presenting possible sanitation and containment issues, meaning that they were messing around with contagions in less than ideal conditions. Further, it seemed that there was an environment of fear endemic in the IHU, evident in this investigation, as several engineers on site told the CHSCT delegation that they were worried about potential punishment from the university for giving statements to the committee. And as such, they were authorized to provide anonymous written testimony on the condition that their statements could be authenticated. 2 admitted to having made false reports about the conclusions of the lab's work, including, quote, falsification of the results of an experiment at the request of a researcher. I wonder who that researcher could have been. A former doctoral student using the pseudonym Matthew, who worked directly under Raoult for 4 years at ERMITE, told Mediapart that he, quote, doesn't permit discussion and that the department goes about things, quote, the opposite way around. He has an idea and we carry out tasks to prove that he is right, and that this is done, quote, with the fear of contradicting him that can lead to biasing results, whereas it's doubt and discussion that allows science to progress. Matthew recalled a specific instance of Raoult explicitly defining the rules of his roost, saying, quote, it was a Wednesday afternoon during a work in progress. That's the moment when those preparing a thesis present the state of their research. We had 5 minutes to present what is sometimes 3 to 4 months of work. That's very short. When there was the least disagreement, Didier Raoult would say, You're not here to think. It's me who does the thinking.
I do not ask too many questions.
Well, what's your name?
Kerensky.
Kerensky?
Fyodor Nikolai.
Fyodor Nikolai Kerensky. A scientist's job is to ask questions.
Matthew further elaborated on Raoult's character, describing him as a man who, quote, shatters any person who is not going in his direction and, like this, holds everyone in fear. And that since leaving the lab in 2015, quote, I don't feel any animosity, but rather concern and wariness. Matthew admitted that this environment had affected his own work, and that he had attached his name to a paper which presented biased results, but that due to his research grant being dependent on the Ermite lab, he followed orders and remained silent with his concerns. He further added that, quote, "Not only did I depend on Raoult for my studies, I had also observed how his reputation allowed him and others close to him to smash the careers of those who contested him." Dominique, another pseudonymous scientist and former head of a unit at INSERM, noted that biased methodology, seeking evidence for presupposed hypotheses rather than unbiased empiricism, is not unique to Raoult, but that what did appear to be unique to him was his particular lack of concern with ethics and the seeming protection from scientific bodies that he possessed. In the mid-2000s, Dominique led an evaluation on the precursor to the IHU commissioned by the CNRS, and said that one of the first things Raoult did upon their meeting was to show off his H-index score on his computer. This woman showed up to review his facility, and Raoult immediately hit her with the "wanna see my H-index." The H-index is a metric of measuring the productivity and essentially success of a scientist or scholar, which is calculated by the number of publications from a given author that have been cited at least that many times by others. For example, a scientist with an H-index of 5 would mean that he or she has published 5 papers that have been cited at least 5 times over. Didier Raoult's H-index score when much of the controversy around him began, in November of 2020, was 147, with the number of times his work had been cited in other literature totaling 115,720 papers, out of his own total of 3,217 publications. As of 2025, his H-index reached 222, more than 3 times that of Einstein, with the number of times his work had been cited in other literature totaling 248,713. Raoult is unquestionably an omnipresent figure in the field of microbiology. Of course, it is fundamentally impossible for one man, even with a team, to publish so many scientific articles, let alone medical studies, and as such, Raoult's massive curricula vitae is more a representation of the work of the IHU and the Ermite/Mephi labs than it is of him as an individual, illustrated not only in the department's emphasis on pumping out papers, but also in his treatment of his students and colleagues who inevitably conduct much of the actual work behind the research that he assigns his name to, which was evident to Dominique, who noted how, quote, "His laboratory welcomes numerous foreign students. We were able to notice pressure exerted upon them, being in a more precarious position than other researchers, and how some of those students had alerted her to certain studies having arranged desired results, as part of the paper mill that the unit had become." Dominique alerted the CNRS and INSERM about her concerns with the program after her visit in 2006, and again in 2009, long before the IHU became internationally famous. Yet both times, said concerns went unanswered by the governing bodies, which she told Mediapart she believed was a coordinated effort to bury criticism of Raoult precisely because of the impressiveness of his program and his personal H-index. And to be frank, I can understand why. I have never seen an H-index score, total number of publications, or sheer number of citations held by a single scientist in well over a decade of reading scientific research myself on nearly a daily basis. To call him a titan would be an understatement, and while utterly unethical, it makes sense why his prestige was being so protected and the voices of those who dared defy him so systematically silenced. Another former researcher in Raoult's lab working at INSERM in 2017, going by the pseudonym Antoine, also provided statements to Mediapart regarding his experiences, under the stipulation that it be made known that he wanted no affiliation with the ongoing COVID and HCQ controversies, but that Raoult's championing of the drug was concordant with his personal interactions with Raoult, stating of him that he, quote, "always wants to be the first, and that he's talked about, which leads him to move fast, but the rigor of the scientific method is sometimes open to criticism." Antoine left the lab after he got into a confrontation with Raoult when he refused to be included on a publication about a novel strain of virus and its function, as he felt they, quote, "did not have sufficient elements of proof to go so far in the interpretations, and that, quote, to do so could lead to making assertions that were not scientifically demonstrated." Similarly to Matthew, Antoine told Mediapart that he found this sort of work to be scientifically dissatisfying and lacking in methodological rigor, in favor of following Raoult's directives, who Antoine reported was known to often say, quote, "When I say something, it is right." This was all apparently not a more recent development or change of character in Raoult that occurred over time as his fame and renown grew, as in 2006, Raoult and his colleagues were banned for a year from publishing research in any journals operating under the American Society for Microbiology, ASM, following the discovery of serious problems with one of his papers in the Journal of Infection and Immunity. Namely, the journal found that in a paper about a mouse model for typhus, Raoult and his co-authors had misrepresented figures. Raoult pled innocent in this matter, instead assigning blame to an innocent mix-up on the part of one of his co-authors. When his appeal was denied, Raoult in turn banned his own department from publishing work in any ASM-affiliated journal in perpetuity. There's proportionate irritation with one of your many papers being retracted, and then there's hamstringing your entire institute just to be petty.
What I don't want to see is the Bills winning the Super Bowl. As long as I'm alive, that doesn't happen.
Could be tough, sir. Buffalo wants it bad.
So did the Soviets in '80.
What, are you saying you rigged the Olympic hockey game?
What's the matter? Don't you believe in miracles?
After receiving these reports and statements from former colleagues, Mediapart attempted to contact Raoult himself, for which they received a response from a doctoral student, Janis Russell, then acting as head of the now perhaps necessary public relations team at the IHU. If you would like to play a, given the runtime, but only because of the runtime, not so dangerous drinking game, take a shot every time Janis here appears in photos and videos of Raoult. If he looks familiar, it's because he's already shown up. So you can start the video over if you really want to 100% Russellmania by taking a shot every time you catch him skulking somewhere around Raoult, like the Grima Wormtongue to Grima Wormtongue. Russell told the outlet, quote, "Concerning the scientific part, our work is evaluated by a scientific council," referring to the IHU's internal council of independent scientists. "We believe that as outside experts, they are best placed to comment on the pertinence of the work carried out at the IHU. In other words, they investigated themselves and found no evidence of wrongdoing. How convenient." Meanwhile, external support for Raoult persisted, as in May of 2020, the head of the publicly funded Institute for Research and Development, IRD, Jean-Paul Moati, penned a piece in the esteemed Lancet defending Raoult's recommendation of HCQ and azithromycin for COVID without declaring his affiliation with Raoult as a potential conflict of interest. On June 24th, Raoult spoke before the National Assembly to defend his use of chloroquine, while also saying that he has never recommended HCQ.
I don't understand how it's possible to ban a drug that, again, just last year was prescribed. If I recall correctly, 36 million tablets were distributed in France freely, even without a prescription. And suddenly, overnight, it's decided that you can't even prescribe it anymore. I don't understand it. I don't approve of it. You know, of course, and I've made this clear. I have a duty to respond to you, so I will. But I've never recommended this treatment because I don't have the legal right to recommend a treatment that's outside its authorized use. I'm not allowed to recommend it.
Despite, saying that anyone who tested positive for COVID could get treated at the IHU with HCQ. Already interested in Raoult's and his colleagues' work, and with more and more information about the suspicious state of the IHU being unveiled, Elizabeth Beek continued to investigate Raoult's litany of papers, and came across an erratum to a Science magazine article from 2012 regarding that one-year-long ban from the ASM, and so sought to find out if it was a persistent issue. In June of 2021, she reported on duplication problems in 19 additional papers from the cohort, which she categorized into 3 degrees of severity. The first category Ms. Beek established includes the reuse of images that had been resized or seemingly copied and pasted from elsewhere in the work, both things that are as easily explained by accident as by malice. The second category included the mirroring, rotating, or overlapping of images, which is a bit more difficult to attribute to error. The third and final of Ms. Beek's categories included figures that were purposefully altered or duplicated, of which she found evidence for in 10 of the 19 papers she assessed. Meanwhile, while all of this was being unveiled, Raoult was granted the title of Commander of the National Order of the Lion by then-President of Senegal, Macky Sall. However, with increasing pressure on the IHU from external observers like Ms. Beek, on June 14th of 2021, both the IHU and the IRD were raided by the French Anti-Corruption Agency, AFA, after being alerted to potential conflicts of interest and misuse of government funds as part of an investigation that had been ongoing since 2019. In that year, the IRD granted 300,000 euros to the IHU under the stewardship of its president, Jean-Paul Moadi, husband of Yolande Obadiah, the IHU's second-in-command besides Raoult. That is, the man in charge of the publicly funded IRD gave 300,000 euros to the institute that his wife and his friend were leading.
And that's Secretary of Education.
It's kind of stupid. Police President Camacho's stepbrother.
This was done without consulting the IHU Council and was not the only grant to the IHU from the IRD, as another contribution of 300,000 euros was made to the IHU via the IRD's Microbiology Resource Center, in an apparent attempt to obfuscate the finance's origin. While those major investments helped construct a nearly 6,500 square meter space for the IHU, that section of the unit employed only 5 people, when such a large amount of space could have easily fit dozens of employees, leading investigators to wonder why so much space had been allocated to so few people, presumably to make room for Didier's ego. Moadi was not unfamiliar with misusing his institute's money either, as the AFA found that he had dipped into the kitty to cover personal expense claims, unrelated to IRD missions, some of which could have derived from public funding. These expenses included private travel, meals, and vacations to Corsica, all billed through the IRD.
We brought in over $40,000.
Unbelievable. Well, most of that money was from the Bluth Company. I mean, how are you?
Given that by this time, hydroxychloroquine, and thereby Raoult, and the research institute synonymous with him, had become a political topic as much as a scientific one in relationship to COVID, it's unsurprising that Miss Beek received harsh backlash of her own for calling out the various problems apparent at the IHU, and she wasn't alone. In reaction to this video of Raoult touting the efficacy of hydroxychloroquine in treating COVID, L'Express journalist Victor Garcia in turn expressed skepticism, which was met by a response from one of Raoult's IHU colleagues and frequent co-author, J.M. Rollane, who told him, quote, "I am a scientist. If I tell you to take chloroquine, you'll listen to me," end quote, as Garcia reported to Science magazine. Clearly, dissenting scientific voices were unwelcome at the IHU, but it didn't end with rebuke and Raoult's lashing out against his critics. For just as the French government was now also turning its eye to Raoult, this conflict would soon turn from mere words to lawfare. Whatever the reason, personal or political initially, Elizabeth Beek and a growing number of scholars and journalists had lit a fire in the field of French microbiology. This was war, and Beek had fired the first shot. By May of 2021, Beek's home address was allegedly shared via Twitter by Raoult's colleague at the IHU, Eric Chabrier, who also spurred on a public campaign against Miss Beek, retweeting an account that called her a murderer and a prostitute. But Dr. Beek was far from the only person to catch Chabrier's ire, as he also compared intensive care physician Damien Barraud, who had been similarly critical of Raoult's work with HCQ, to the murderer of Metz, Francis Home, a French serial killer who was convicted of the murder of 11 people, including 5 victims under the age of 19, 3 of whom were under the age of 10.
Boy, that escalated quickly.
Chabrier also described all of Raoult's critics as akin to the members of the Khmer Rouge, the communist government of Cambodia, responsible for the deaths of millions of people, and Olivier Véran to the dictator of the Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot. He made similar allusions for months, describing Raoult's critics as Khmer Whites, which not only continues to paint said critics as fanatical authoritarian ideologues, but also by using the word white in the French language context, implies that they are bourgeois members of the elite, while he and Raoult are the renegade freedom fighters. Chabrier seems to be particularly obsessed with dictators and murderers, at least when it comes to those not similarly adoring of Raoult as he is, as he tweeted, quote, "Legions of honor, awards, promotions, the swan song of the politico-medical system that has no choice left but to support itself mutually. Patience. In other times, medals were handed out to the last fighters. We know how this ends." Alongside a poster for the film Downfall, that chronicles the dying days of the Nazi regime, when it rewarded its devotees with meaningless medals. While not named, this tweet was clearly aimed at Corinne Lacombe, another of Raoult's many critics who had recently won a Legion of Honor medal. To add irony to the insult, Raoult had held a party at the IHU in January of 2021 where he awarded himself and 1,000 of his closest friends and family with medals in recognition for their service in fighting against COVID. One of these many medals was given to none other but, of course, Janus Russell. Another target of Chabrier was infectious disease specialist Nathan Pfeiffer-Smadja, who had published an article that raised qualms with the use of HCQ for COVID, saying that Pfeiffer-Smadja reminded him of the book Death is My Trade, a novel about the life of Auschwitz attendant Rudolf Hess, and that, like Hess, Pfeiffer-Smadja was, quote, just following orders. He also tweeted out the cover of the book, featuring the image of a Nazi officer superimposed over Auschwitz, saying, quote, these would be the followers of the sect of scientism in another era, with these likely referring to the likes of Beek, Lacombe, Pfeiffer-Smadja, and others. Chabrier similarly posted an image of Dr. Pierre Tadevin, a member of the French COVID-19 Scientific Council, who expressed skepticism towards Raoult's findings with HCQ, photoshopped onto a now rather politically incorrect Tintin cartoon of black Africans carrying Tadevin on a palanquin, describing him as a racist colonialist who looks down on African health systems for using HCQ as primitive, while countering Tadevin's claims that the situation in France was not comparable to that of Africa because of the comparatively younger average age of the population in African countries relative to France, by stating that the life expectancy in Raoult's birth nation of Senegal is a whopping 67 years of age. Given that the average life expectancy in France is 82.2, I'm not exactly sure how this proves his point that African nations were not less affected by COVID because they do not have similarly aged populations, but I digress. To add absurdity to the Nazi allusions made by Chabrier, he also accused journalist Patrick Cohen, another HCQ skeptic and critic of both Raoult and Chabrier, of misleading the French public, and likened him to a member of Radio Paris, Vichy France's propaganda outlet that collaborated with the Nazis during the German occupation. If the surname wasn't enough of a giveaway, Patrick Cohen is Jewish. When Leonid Schneider, the founder of the data sleuthing blog For Better Science, called out Chabrier for making a prolonged mockery of the Holocaust, Chabrier in turn accused Schneider of anti-Semitism, for which Schneider, and not Chabrier, was suspended from Twitter for 12 hours. He similarly responded to a tweet of the poster for Schindler's List, calling it Schneider's List. Like Patrick Cohen, Leonid Schneider is also Jewish. Even more ironic, considering Chabrier's insistence on calling everyone not thoroughly in the Raoult camp a racist Nazi, is that Chabrier has tweeted out some rather spicy things himself, including retweeting the account Cunegonde 1944, in which he appears to threaten Pfeiffer-Smadja with doxing, and says that things on the darknet are sunshine compared to what Pfeiffer-Smadja is guilty of, while linking to an article from right-wing outlet Secular Response, known for its strong anti-Islam stances. The aforementioned article described critics of Christian Perron, another French scientist with similar views on HCQ as Raoult, and specifically Pfeiffer-Smadja, as remdesivir apologist scum. Cunegonde also tweeted out a photo of him meeting in person with Chabrier for an interview. Eric retweeted an article from Francois, a right-wing outlet with an emphasis on conspiracy theories in support of far-right politician Florian Philippot, likely because Philippot had been critical of the actions of Olivier Véran. Chabrier also promoted the COVID documentary Hold Up, which was largely removed from the internet for promoting various conspiracy theories about the virus. And speaking of conspiracy theories, Chabrier was big into QAnon, calling for a release of the Kraken, which he seems to think is Didier Raoult. I point all of this out not because I object to Chabrier's politics inherently, as schizophrenic as they are, but instead merely because it's just a bit funny that a QAnon, 5G, NWO conspiracy theory kinda guy who promoted a documentary wherein it is claimed that the French government invented COVID.
For the professor, there is no doubt. The virus indeed came from the Pasteur Institute, before being sent to Wuhan or elsewhere. The culprit of COVID-19 has indeed been found.
And seems to have issues with both Islam and Jews, is also going around calling everyone even mildly critical of his idol and employer of being a murderous, racist Nazi. Pick a side, Eric. Chabrier didn't just post these types of unhinged messages at Raoult's critics in a vacuum either. He did so while bragging about how he was protected by the IHU, which he said would pay him to go on vacation as a reward for his service. And he also more than once referenced the IHU's attorney, Bryce Grazzini, implying that he was being supplied by Grazzini with the names of targets for his actions. And it wasn't the only time that Chabrier would imply or directly state that he had such a list, as in a tweet where he portrayed Raoult as an anti-hero, posting an image of his face crudely photoshopped onto a poster for Leon the Professional, aka Le Professionnel, keep that in mind. He also posted a list of names of those who had levied complaints against the IHU, saying, quote, "Carts are on the way" for them, likely a reference to carts carrying prisoners to the guillotine during the French Revolution. Further evidencing, however, the coordination between Chabrier's attacks and the university, Eric posted an email from an Aix-Marseille University employee, Alexandra Patrelot, sent to the AMU president, Eric Burton, criticizing Chabrier's behavior, in which she said that the public was opening their eyes to Chabrier, and that Burton's silence on the matter, quote, "makes you complicit and tarnishes the academic community." Chabrier himself responded to Patrelot's email by alerting her that he had forwarded her email to an AMU attorney for coordinated harassment. Just to reiterate, this university employee sent an email to her boss with concerns about the power seemingly held by Chabrier, who goes around schizo-posting on Twitter about the Holocaust and the Khmer Rouge, and her email to her boss was intercepted by said schizo, who responded to her with a legal threat and then tweeted it all out to his followers, definitively proving that these people weren't all coordinating at all. It's unclear whether or not Chabrier was CC'd on this email, but it certainly raises some ethical questions as well as legal ones. As were Chabrier not CC'd by Patrelot, he could have violated French law. As Article 226.15 of the French Penal Code states, quote, "The opening, deletion, delay, or diversion of correspondence addressed to third parties is punishable by up to 1 year in prison and a 45,000 euro fine." Given that this particular instance was not a legal avenue against Chabrier that seems to have ever been pursued, I am unsure if he actually violated the law here, but it is questionably legal to say the least. His initial tweet describes Patrelot as rickety and as a Scientologue, and that she was the one harassing his employer. Chabrier then retweeted his post containing the email and his response to it with a photo from the film American Sniper, alongside the text, "Monarchs playing the tough guy," both seemingly accusing Patrelot of being the anonymous Twitter user Mononoxid, another of Raoult's many critics, and of being an internet tough guy. Rickety is an insult that Chabrier seems particularly fond of lobbing at his enemies, referring to rickets, a disease caused by vitamin D deficiency, implying that anyone who doesn't love Raoult as much as he does is a shut-in who needs to go outside and touch grass, but also that they are physically and perhaps even mentally disabled. In a particularly cruel instance of this, he posted a DM that he had received from someone named Steve, who said in response to Chabrier's frequent use of the term, quote, "Dear sir, I'm rickety, and you." In turn, Chabrier used this message as confirmation that all of his ops are vitamin D deficient, depressed losers who live with their parents and should call the SOS Amitié, a French suicide prevention and emotional support hotline. But in this case, Steve meant it quite literally, as he contacted Leonid Schneider with this exchange and explained that he suffers from Charcot-Marie tooth disease, which causes muscle weakness and atrophy, often noticeably affecting one's gait. As such, in this instance, someone who suffers with a disease that presents with some similar symptoms to that of rickets objected to Chabrier's use of the term, only for him to be used as evidence that indeed, all of Raoult's critics are mentally and physically disabled freaks who live in their mom's basement and are on constant suicide watch. None of this is particularly atypical for Twitter, but remember, this isn't some random troll. This guy is a professor at a medical institution and is tweeting all of this under his real name and affiliation with that institute, essentially performing a public rendition of It's Always Sunny in Marseille.
Now check out his legs. See how they've almost healed? They're like pretty much back to perfect. Yeah. And check out his cane. It looks like he's whittled it into some sort of defensive tool. Wow.
If all of these attacks weren't personal enough, they became uniquely personal when Chabrier's anger allegedly turned to Raoult's own daughter, Dr. Magali Carcopino-Tussoli, who had been estranged from him for a decade before this entire fiasco even began. A Twitter account with the handle LaProfession9 made a series of rude comments about Mag, calling her an ugly duckling and an acorn, using the same French word for idiot as for acorn, from a family of shining oaks, allegedly amongst more serious criticisms of her skills as a medical professional, which, given the account suspension, are now inaccessible for further review, at least for me, but were presumably taken into consideration in the French courts after Dr. Carcopino-Tussoli chose to sue Dr. Chabrier for defamation under the auspices that the Le Professionnel account was his, probably at least in part because he frequently posted that Photoshop of Raoult as Leon the Professional. Not only had the owner of the Le Professional account previously responded affirmatively to Bean Chabrier when questioned about its identity by Carcopino-Tussoli's attorney, Philip Carlini, posing as an anonymous Twitter user, Carlini's investigation further revealed that the phone number associated with both Chabrier and the Le Professional account were identical, which Chabrier explained as being due to his number being publicly accessible, and that the Le Professional account was not him, but instead a dedicated stalker. However, Carlini also reported that the IP addresses accessing the accounts were the same as well. For the Le Professionel account to not be Chabrier himself, it must then have been someone accessing the internet from the same IP address, using Chabrier's phone number to defend his hero only slightly more viciously than he already does on his primary account. But despite all of the evidence that Le Professionel was Chabrier, regardless of whether or not the claims made by the anonymous account were defamatory, the case was resolved in favor of Chabrier due to an inability to definitively prove he was the operator of the Le Professionel account, resulting in Carcopino-Tussoli being forced to pay 2,000 euros in his legal fees in May of 2023.
You killed him! I never touched him!
That wouldn't be the end of Chabrier's legal troubles, as in March of 2023, he was contacted via phone by a gendarme, reminding him that he was to appear in court the following day regarding an investigation into online harassment perpetrated by the Le Professional account unrelated to Mag's lawsuit against him. In response to this call, Chabrier told the officer, quote, "You're no good for summoning me. When I was in the army, I'd bring people like you into line. You'll have the prosecutor and the entire gendarmerie on your back." He then threatened to have him transferred from Marseille to Brest or Mayotte. The officer proceeded to ask if Chabrier required a court-appointed lawyer, to which he retorted, "Do I look like I should have a court-appointed lawyer? Well, no, Eric. I think you should pay for one. I think you should have hired this guy."
I don't care about the $5. I care about please don't kill yourself. At least be killed by a black. Just walk to the hospital, you useless piece of shit.
This time, Chabrier found himself on the wrong side of the law and was charged with intimidating a peace officer, who, I must remind you, was merely making a courtesy call when Chabrier decided to insult him. The gendarme said he had never, in his 23 years of service, been spoken to in such a manner, leading to Eric being slapped with a fine for 5,000 euros and 1,500 euros in compensatory damages to the gendarme. So, while Chabrier was able to have his legal fees covered in Carcopino-Tussoli's case against him, in his obstinance towards the legal process, he ended up costing himself nearly 3 times his initial defense totals in fees. That gendarme made 1,500 euros in one phone call. Are we sure he's not part of the medical industry? If it has not yet been made abundantly clear, there's a good reason why others and Chabrier himself declared him to be the online sheriff of the IHU. The man seems to see his life through the lens of his favorite action films, with Eric cast in the role of Didier Raoult's personal attack dog, his internet assassin. Perhaps most telling of Chabrier's dedication to his Dr. Daddy is that much of the harassment received by Carcopino-Tussoli and others from the Le Professionel account occurred after the IHU decided not to renew Chabrier's contract in August of 2021, meaning that after a certain point, he was quite literally doing all of this for free. Fabrice Franck, an ex-biologist and information technology consultant who had been investigating Raoult's work, was also the subject of rude remarks online from Raoult's colleagues, namely Eric Chabrier and Audrey Calvo, cartoonishly enough, the coordinator for the Aix-Marseille University Ethics Committee. In early 2024, Franck learned of the retraction of 6 papers from the IHU, and, curious to learn more, privately contacted the AMU-IHU Commission for Access to Administrative Documents, CADA, who informed him that the documents are available to anyone who requests them, and thus he emailed the ethics coordinator, Audrey Calvo, for the documents, to which she replied that she was too busy to answer his inquiry. When he returned to the CADA for assistance, they indicated that too busy was not a valid excuse for inaction, After another email to Calvo was met with silence, just days later, he found fellow IHU member Chabrier mocking him on Twitter, saying of Frank that, quote, "He's all grumpy. The university sent him packing. The university has no time to waste on bitter mediocrities." And that, quote, "Fabrice Frank never talks about his hobbies in Morocco. Does he host at his home? In a hotel? In private establishments?" Suggesting sexual impropriety on Frank's part, perhaps with underaged male prostitutes, and perhaps making an allusion to infamous French philosopher and alleged pedophile Michel Foucault, known for his critical theory that continues to affect leftist political thought to this day, and who was widely rumored to have engaged in such behaviors in the nearby fellow formerly French protectorate of Tunisia, and which was covered up for decades due to the respect that he had earned himself in academic circles. Rather than doing her job, it was fairly clear that Calvo had instead been busy gossiping and concocting allegations of sexual impropriety with her co-workers around Fabrice Frank, following his simple request for public information. Calvo went on to continue to deride Frank in private, accusing him of harassing her, stating, quote, "I am being harassed and threatened by pseudo-researchers, pseudo-whistleblowers. Do you know that there is a legal status for whistleblowers, right? We'll talk about it when you return from Morocco," complete with 3 crying laughing emojis, on which she CC'd Jean-Francois Delfrazy, a member of the IHU's board who, in addition to being a friend of Raoult, is also the president of the National Consultative Ethics Committee. To really underline just how unethical these scientific ethics officers are in practice, not only were they actively preventing another scholar from accessing information that was supposed to be available to researchers, but they were doing so while making repeated allusions to him being a homosexual or even a pedophile, and all while giggling with one another about it.
This residence houses a known pedophile. Oh, no. Whose house are we sneaking this out the front of?
Frank did, of course, eventually gain access to the documents, now surely only further driven to expose the corruption at the IHU, much like Misspeak, by the actions of its members, on top of the overwhelming evidence of scientific misconduct. Accusing those on the receiving end of her petty cattiness of being the true harassers is also not unique to this instance for Audrey Calvo, as in June of 2024, a biomedicine-focused writer for the Scientific Fraud and Ethics Project for Better Science, who goes by the pseudonym Cheshire, published concerns to PubPeer regarding 2 papers authored by Lahoussine Ouafik, a professor at Aix-Marseille, in which the blots seemed suspiciously copied and pasted or rotated and zoomed, similar to what Misspeak found in her investigation of Raoult's research. Calvo accused Cheshire of harassment and defamation, and responded to his concerns by saying that he is ignorant of French law, and that French researchers do not respond individually to inquiries into their research. You know, like she was doing in that very instance. To which Cheshire posted a tweet of Raoult evoking law enforcement and describing Elizabeth Beek's actions similarly as being harassment. This provoked the founder and editor of For Better Science, Leonid Schneider, to contact Calvo for clarification on whether or not criticism of research was defamatory under French law, as she had implied to Cheshire. It seems that was, in fact, what Calvo was implying, as she responded to Schneider by stating, quote, "I am referring to the French law and the Declaration of Helsinki concerning the protection of persons in research." The Declaration of Helsinki, as Leonid replied, and as will come up again later in this video, quote, "protects human subjects of medical research from abuse by medical researchers, not medical researchers from having to answer for their fake Western blot figures." To which Calvo wrote, quote, "Dear anonymous admirer, the university only takes official requests into account, and as I have already written to you, we have officially replied to the reviews concerning this," end quote. Upon being sent more evidence of gels that appeared to have been tampered with, Calvo again responded by saying, quote, "We know who you are and that you have already been prosecuted for harassment for several years now, so we will not respond to you under the penalty of filing a new complaint against you." Once again, immediately jumping to legal threats. Leonid told her eloquently to stick her new complaint along with a previously failed harassment lawsuit against him, where the sun don't shine. It is true that Schneider had previously been the subject of a lawsuit over claims of harassment, from none other than Didier Raoult himself. In July of 2021, Raoult, the IHU, and Chabrier filed legal complaints against both Schneider and Alexander Samuel for, quote, false accusation, defamation, harassment, and attempted blackmail in response to their ongoing investigations into Raoult's work, stating in their complaint that, quote, while debates on ideas are acceptable and to a certain extent beneficial to society as a whole, this is no longer the case when such debates descend into defamatory or abusive attacks that are not based on scientific evidence. While Chabrier was dropped as a complainant after he failed to pay his deposit of 3,000 euros, Raoult's and the IHU's complaints went forward, despite also not paying their own deposits of 3,000 euros and 6,000 euros on time, respectively. Eventually, the case against Schneider was dropped altogether, perhaps because he lives in Germany, but the complaint against Samuel did go forward, albeit only for a short period of time until his attorney found out that the IHU was being legally represented by the institution's chair, Yolanda Obadiah, something that she did not have the authority to do. Further, in a biography of Raoult, summarized by Samuel in his blog, Raoult made personal friends and potential allies across the political spectrum, which included Obadiah, a friendship that presented a clear conflict of interest for the IHU and Raoult's lawsuits. Even had they not been friends, their professional relationship alone presented a similar conflict of interest, as until 2011, Obadiah had been the director of the precursor to the IHU and Raoult its president, with the two switching roles, but maintaining the same professional interdependent musical chairs. After these issues were raised to the court, the IHU and Raoult lost their litigation attempt against Samuel. In the summer of 2023, Obadiah would go on to plead guilty to an illegal conflict of interest involving the IHU after it was revealed that her husband, Jean-Paul Mawadi, had donated 300,000 euros to the Institute in 2017, at which time the two were in a cohabitating relationship, yet neither recused themselves at the time of signing this agreement. While the two faced a 16,000 euro fine with 6,000 suspended for their admission of guilt in this scheme, the penalty for this offense could have been up to 5 years in prison, accompanied by a ban on standing for public office. Further regarding lawsuits, Raoult also threatened and later pursued Dr. Beek with a lawsuit for the same offenses, harassment and extortion, with the latter being attributed to the existence of her Patreon account, which gave people an avenue to support her work. Under that definition, this video is also extortion. But speaking of Elizabeth Beek's work, in May of 2021, despite facing potential legal action from Raoult and the IHU, Beek reported to Science magazine that she had uncovered additional problems in a total of 63 papers published by Raoult's group, and had left comments on 258 of his papers on the website PubPeer. PubPeer was also a target for mounting litigant Raoult, specifically its administrator and research director at the CNRS, Boris Barber, who he accused of complicity in Beek's alleged crimes of harassment and extortion by not deleting her comments.
I want everything about my house off the internet!
The CNRS Ethics Committee denounced Raoult's legal actions on its website as an, quote, unacceptable strategy of intimidation. It's evident that not only were Raoult and the IHU more than happy to engage in legal intimidation tactics to silence criticism, but that those tactics were well funded. By May of 2021, according to an article in Marianne, Raoult had filed legal complaints against nearly a dozen of his critics, financing his legal fees, already totaling around 66,000 euros, with the IHU's coffers. Despite having no explicit approval from the board of directors to utilize the foundation's funds in such a manner. That didn't appear to matter much at Aix-Marseille, staffed from top to bottom with those loyal to the increasingly embattled microbiologist. When Marianne journalists contacted the university hospital for comment, they were informed that Raoult's legal protection was granted by the president of the foundation, once again, Yolanda Obadiah. Raoult justified his use of the IHU's money by stating that he had personally initiated the complaints and need not involve the university's board of directors. But his statements were directly contradicted by Chairman Francois Cremieux, the rector and government commissioner of Aix-Marseille, who ensures that the foundation's decisions comply with the law. Cremieux instead told Marianne that, quote, the complaints were lodged by Professor Raoult or his colleagues, and as such they can only be legally supported on the basis of a decision by the board of directors. So, which is it? Does he need the board's approval or not? Regardless of who began the individual legal battles and regardless of whether or not he need consult the board, it was still the IHU a non-for-profit foundation for scientific cooperation footing the bill for Raoult's war. And that means at the end of the line, it was the French people paying for these lawsuits. Specifically, between 2010 and 2019, the IHU was granted a total of 72 million euros in a call for research projects from the French National Research Agency, which is why the university employs Crimu to act as a go-between for the government and the university in the first place. In May of 2021, Raoult filed an additional lawsuit against Dr. Guilherme Gorencourt, the vice president and head of the ethics committee for the Council of the Order of Doctors of Bouches-du-Rhône. Ironically enough, for unethical behavior and defamation for posting about 50 tweets about Raoult in November of 2020. I have not been able to locate the results of all of these lawsuits as of the making of this video, but by the 6th of July of 2023, a Marsoctu report claimed that the cost of Raoult's lawsuits had already reached 95,400 euros of very arguably taxpayer money. Whatever the source of all of the IHU's funding, and whoever else profited from these affiliations, which we will learn more about in just a bit, the end result was the same. Raoult was responsible, directly or indirectly, for bringing in a lot of money and opportunities for those working at the IHU, and whatever the total amount, it was more than enough to inspire intense loyalty from many of those around him, who also benefited by his name. As such, the IHU had become a veritable who's who club of Raoult's most dedicated sycophants, all invested in maintaining the money machine. So let's turn our attention to the clinical clique that was the network of Raoult's friends and colleagues at the IHU. Evidence of pervasive cronyism within the IHU was mounting, as not only was there money on the line, but according to interviews conducted by Mediapart in October of 2021 with anonymous employees of the Institute, any and all criticism of Raoult was forbidden, hence their insistence on anonymity. Quote, "For years there has been no veritable science behind the publications at the IHU," said one of the physicians contacted by Mediapart, continuing by saying that, quote, "The results presented have to correspond with the hypotheses of Didier Raoult. In the case of the contrary, the people concerned might be publicly devalued, with doubt cast on their competence. To instead then quote the 33rd rule of acquisition, it never hurts to suck up to the boss." A different staff member remarked that the entire institute was designed to essentially reinforce the mediatization of Didier Raoult, and had created a, quote, "climate of cult of personality." The veneration for Raoult was so ubiquitous that, according to this staffer, there were, quote, "videos of Didier Raoult constantly playing inside the IHU building." Another spoke of staff meetings attended by Raoult where, quote, "if one asks questions, the answer is often, 'Shut up, you're not paid to think.'"
There shouldn't be an opinion in your head that I haven't put there.
From these interviews, and with the knowledge of just how important the IHU was to the university, it's no wonder Raoult felt entitled not only to cry bully from his protected position, but also to spend the funds said position secured to the IHU on his own lawsuits against those who dared criticize him. Even if Raoult wasn't directly enriching himself off of the IHU, he was responsible for bringing in both public and private funding to the Institute, which he in turn used to fund his lawsuits. Again, meaning that the French taxpayers were footing those bills. Raoult, not satisfied by Lawfare alone, went on to describe Bic as crazy to news outlets, and stated that rude comments, such as hers, should not be tolerated in science.
Me, personally, it's not that it bothers me, but I do attract attention. There are a number of reactions that I thought were incredible. There are people who insult me, who complain to the Orders Council. There's a crazy person who goes through the 3,500 posts I've made to see if I made a mistake. It's not that it keeps me up at night, but overall, it means that there he goes wild in these conditions. Personally, I think you should not tolerate that on television sets. I think the Council of the Order should not tolerate that because we have to live together. After, we have the right to have different opinions. We have the duty to communicate objective and real data, even when it's unpleasant, objective data. That's where it stops, if possible, without naming people. But beyond that, if you will, we end up losing the social connection. It should not be done. So I am not going to set fire to this country.
Well, which way is it, Frenchman? I suppose rude comments such as calling someone crazy are only ethically acceptable when the great Didier Raoult makes them. Raoult's lawyer similarly described Biek's comments as obsessive, notifications of her comments on PubPeer as a form of harassment against both Raoult and the various journal editors, although apparently not Boris Barber, that what she was doing was extortion and blackmail akin to violence, questioned where she was obtaining her resources from, implied she was seeking fame, fortune, and even a job at the IHU, wrote off her critiques as simply political due to her use of the term colonial in describing some of Raoult's work, further implicated PubPeer as facilitating the harassment by not moderating her comments, and stated definitively that the facts were on his and Raoult's side.
224 is huge. One must spend crazy time, since every time a comment is posted on the PubPeer site, the authors of the criticized studies receive a notification from PubPeer that there is a comment made, plus the notifications that have been made simultaneously to the editors, because that's it too. There are the editors who are targeted by the notifications and who will therefore ask questions, demand accountability from the authors of the criticized studies. So that goes beyond scientific critique. Yes, she did. In any case, she does analysis on other researchers, but what's crazy is that on the IHU, there was really a focus all of a sudden. Criticism thing, when it goes beyond all that, it's harassment. But she basically says, I will stop criticizing the IHU studies if either you hire me for me to analyze the studies there of the IHU, or you can even fund me. This is where we fall into an attempt at blackmail. And if we can think that harassment causes harm and can maybe be considered violence, it's more blackmail, it's more an attempt at blackmail. We go a step above on attempted extortion, since extortion requires coercion or violence. And is it the financial demand that involves this element? Of course, it's the demand for coercion. That's why I clearly stated that it was an attempted blackmail, an attempted extortion. The criticism she publishes exceed well, in any case, are no longer within the scientific framework. It also demonstrates that the purpose of her critique is not to advance science. When she calls 25 studies from the IHU neocolonial, the term neocolonial obviously cannot be considered a scientific critique. How does it advance anything, where, how? We are outside of that, and the reason why we also decided to take action against the PubPeer site, in any case, one of the administrators of the site PubPeer, Mr. Barber, it's because there is supposed to be moderation, which we can see when a non-scientific critique is published on the PubPeer site. Well, immediately the moderator steps in to remove that critique. Out of 25, there have been at least 25 publications of critiques and comments from Madame Elisabeth Bisch, who is labeling the studies as neocolonial. We are no longer in the objective of the PubPeer site. And once again, it is a demonstration not only of harassment, and that this harassment is part of a larger strategy, which is that of blackmail or attempted blackmail, even extortion. No, it's to say, look, we have facts. They are legally chargeable, and we'll see what the justice system thinks about it.
So I think the extortion and the blackmailing are based on two tweets. In one tweet, I asked Xavier, a professor who's working for Raoult, I asked him to support my Patreon account, because he was repeatedly asking me, who is paying you? I'm like, oh, here's my Patreon account. And so it was sort of meant as a joke. I had not expected him to really support my work, but and it's also not really blackmailing, because I didn't ask him, give me money or else I'll do something else. So the harassment claim, I believe, is based on the fact that I've posted about 60 papers from DJ Raoul's lab on Papier. And every time I post something there, the corresponding author or any other authors that you add on it will get an email. So every time I post something there, DJ Raoul and some of his other co-authors got an email from me. So because I posted 60 papers, they probably got 60 emails from Papier saying, hey, Elise Big posted a comment about your paper.
Not only are some of these things mutually exclusive to one another, but the science was not as settled as Raoult's attorney seemed to think it was. There is a sort of cruel irony in Raoult's lamentation of the harassment that he was forced to endure by reading Beek's comments, while she was also facing significant public backlash for criticizing a man who had become such a national scientific hero that in May of 2020, a French poll found that 30% of the population had more trust in Raoult than in Oliver Véran.
I'm trying to be as professional as I can be and not be discouraged by all these harassment that I'm currently facing online, which appear to be very coordinated. These are coordinated attacks, trying to rip all my papers apart, trying to change my Wikipedia entry. There's a lot of trolls trying to discredit me.
By Christmas of that same year, terracotta figures of him were being sold to include in nativity displays, rather reminiscent of the similarly sacrilegious Anthony Fauci votive candles. And speaking of votive candles, well, Raoult's face was plastered on those as well. Despite Didier's renown, more than 2,000 scientists and scientific organizations signed a letter in support of Miss Beek to mitigate a potential chilling effect on peer review that Raoult was, at this point, clearly attempting to initiate to anyone paying attention and not already enamored with the anointed academic. So how did that support, on either side, pan out in the long run? Again, with increased fame, too comes increased scrutiny. And in September of 2020, Raoult was called before the French Senate for questioning regarding his claims and research concerning hydroxychloroquine, in which he swore that he had never engaged in scientific fraud of any sort.
I don't like being insulted, I don't like having complaints filed against me, and then being asked to debate in all serenity. I do not do it, and so I am telling you very solemnly, and after swearing to tell the truth, I have never cheated in my life. I have written 3,500 international publications, and I have never retracted any of them. So of course, out of 3,500, there were some errors that slipped through. For now, there is a girl who is tracking me, a headhunter since I've been famous, who managed to find 5 errors out of 3,500. There are probably many more than that. I estimate there are between 2 and 4% errors in the papers I've done. And so I wouldn't be surprised if more errors are found, but I have to tell you that I am just a poor human and I make mistakes like everyone else.
But that wasn't the only, at least slightly inaccurate statement that he provided to the Senate. Considering that he had a few I am the science moments of his own and his passing resemblance to Darth Sidious, I'm surprised he didn't say I am the Senate. One of the claims he was asked to substantiate was that, quote, there are 4.6 billion people living in countries where hydroxychloroquine is recommended, which he had published in an editorial in the European Journal of International Medicine in June of 2020. By that point in time, the WHO had paused all research on HCQ for the treatment of COVID and had officially advised against treating patients with HCQ and against self-treatment with the drug. Similarly, the European Medicines Agency had recommended against its use, meaning the drug was now de facto banned in research worldwide. This seemingly coordinated decision from large medical oversight agencies to cease the study of HCQ quickly became the subject of conspiracy crafting, as covered in a paper from Muccielli 2020, particularly concerning competing antiviral medication vying for use in the treatment of COVID, remdesivir. Unlike generic HCQ, remdesivir is patented and manufactured by the American pharmaceutical giant Gilead Science, meaning that there would be significant financial interest for the company were remdesivir to be the drug of choice for the pandemic rather than chloroquine. Gilead is one of the most profitable pharmaceutical companies in the world, posting $24.4 billion in sales in 2020, a 10% increase compared to the previous year, and ranks amongst the likes of Pfizer, Merck, Johnson & Johnson, Sanofi, and AstraZeneca on the global market. Its shareholders include some of the US's largest investment groups, including the Vanguard Group, a direct competitor of BlackRock, and Capital Research and Management. The link between Gilead and the COVID response in France is well documented. In the early days of the pandemic, 12 of the 20 experts who would go on to make recommendations to the Minister of Health had participated on Gilead Sciences boards. One of them, Yazdan Yazdapana, who would become a member of both the French Scientific Council on COVID, CS-COVID, and the Committee for Analysis, Research and Expertise, CARE, was an important figure during the crisis, entrusted with directing the government response. Yazdapana is a leader of INSERM, which also employs Yavis Levy, the husband of former Health Minister Agnes Boujan, and Dominique Castagliola, both of whom would go on to publicly criticize Raoult, and had been provided with Gilead products free of charge, namely remdesivir for use in his own research on COVID. Another critic of Raoult, Karine Lacombe, had reported both personal fees and non-financial support from Gilead as listed conflicts of interest in her own research on remdesivir and COVID, co-authored with Yazdapana and Castagliola. In November of 2020, the French High Council of Public Health declared Gilead's remdesivir to be, quote, the only formalized treatment option for the novel coronavirus. Despite being similarly appointed to CS-COVID, Raoult resigned from the board following the High Council's declaration. Although we will learn more about Raoult's own financial investment in the COVID crisis later on, he was far from alone in potentially profiting from the pandemic professionally. This preference for Gilead's patented antiviral over generic HCQ does impart important context to understand the actions of Raoult and his supporters going forward, as it certainly must have seemed that Big Pharma and doctors had colluded to set the course of COVID treatment, at least from Raoult's perspective. Were I in his shoes, I certainly would have thought as much. Returning to Raoult's own research into HCQ and potential ethical violations committed in his alleged promotion and use of HCQ without control groups, Raoult told the Senate,
I am very wary of all fads, so I am not very sensitive to that either. The methodological fads, they are methodological fads, okay? And as now the recommendations have been, since something called evidence-based medicine was developed, is to say, listen, you need to have 1 or 2 randomized trials. So regarding that, they studied it, and they are the kings of this analysis. They analyzed 250 meta-analyses, meaning analyses that gathered several years, so more than 4,000 analyses to see if there was a difference in results and quality between randomized studies and observational studies. And the conclusion is that there is no difference. So the fact that randomized studies are the alpha and omega of therapeutic management is just wrong. So we need to be a bit more peaceful with this before saying, you know, it's the rule, it's like that. Otherwise, you're finished, and we know better. It's ideology. It's one of the reasons why I don't want to discuss this on an ideological level. And I've tried to express that as a doctor, I don't want to do that. That is, I cannot tell a patient, listen, I will give you something. I don't know if there's a treatment in it or not, and I'll randomly assign you. I don't know how to do it. I never knew how to do it, and I won't do it. And the patients who accept it, I assure you, either they didn't understand or most refuse, because that's not what we're here for. And so it's a real question whether we become obsessed with a method, if you will, or are we in the millennial contract of I will do the best I can with what I know or what I believe I know at this moment specifically for you. There you go. There's a takeover by the methodologists. It's not meant to validate the methodology, it's to determine if it's ethical. That's what it means. Are we allowed to do this in that situation? There you go. And so this drift of, yes, we are allowed to do this in that situation, you have the right to conduct experimentation in that situation. Well, I think the legislator must tackle this issue, this reflection on human experimentation, knowing that, listen, the idea of having us get a CPP to do a pharyngeal swab, I think it's ridiculous, you see. I didn't take it seriously. And I think that, on the other hand, conducting trials, I have a great aversion to non-inferiority trials. Non-inferiority trial means telling people, I don't know if we can make people accept saying to someone, we're going to test a drug to find out if it is as good as the reference treatment. But who can do that? What person is going to accept such a thing? But there are about 10 non-inferiority trials that are done. All new drugs are done with non-inferiority trials because they are not better than the others. It's not true, we can't prove it. So, if you will, there is a real deep reflection to be had. Moral, I think, which is also probably one of the elements that sparked such a conflict. There you go.
In his concluding statement to the Senate, Raoult said that taking responsibility and admitting fault is complicated.
It's that when people have taken a path, probably including me for that matter, it's very, very difficult to stray from the path we've entered. It's very complicated to say, listen, we were wrong. In the end, that's not how it should have been done. It's complicated for each of us, but it's complicated for the minister, it's complicated for the president of the republic, it's complicated for Del Fresi, and it's probably complicated for me, even if I'm not clear from that point of view, because I don't see it.
But he did ultimately apologize, although he insisted that he was merely utilizing his right to free speech in his support for HCQ and COVID, while once again insisting that it was the sugary sphere controversy that people should be concerned with, not his own dodgy research. And finally, he concluded that he would be vindicated by history.
No, well, I don't really know. Medicine is a professional thing. I apologize, okay? Once again, I apologize. I am French, but first, I do not belong to you, meaning my scientific word is a free word, guaranteed by the Constitution and the history of this country, and it addresses a lot of people around the world. For now, once again, it's not me who spread nonsense about the toxicity of a medication, which was prescribed to 2 billion people. I'm not talking nonsense. We'll see. You will see. For now, the files and publications on the use of hydroxychloroquine that show it reduces mortality by 30 to 50% are accumulating. You will see.
Raoult chose to speak at the Senate alone rather than with a round table of 2 fellow experts who we've already met, Dominique Castagliola, the Director of Human Research at INSERM, and Yazdan Yazdapana. In addition to their affiliation with Remdesivir, Castagliola was also amongst a number of scholars who signed an op-ed published on the 15th of September 2020 in Liberation, calling for a stop to scientific fraud. The letter did not name Raoult directly, but seemed to be referring to the scandals surrounding him and the study of HCQ and COVID more broadly, stating the problems as, quote, a few minority but over-mediated researchers who have, quote, durably distorted and altered the image of science and research. Really is a mystery as to who they could have been talking about there, now isn't it? Raoult was not without his own supporters in the Senate, however, as president of the Republicans, Bruno Retailleau, supported the use of HCQ, stating, quote, there are studies all over the world, some negative, some positive. More than 3,000 patients were treated in Marseille with results. It's not chloroquine that kills, it's the pandemic. Renaud Muselier, the president of the Regional Council of Provence-Alpes-Côte d'Azur, described Raoult in glowing terms, glazing him, if you will, saying that Raoult is being persecuted because he is atypical and has long hair.
The person is atypical, he is brilliant, he is Nobel-worthy, he is exceptional, he created his IHU by himself. He suffers because he has long hair, he was mocked for a long time, okay, we're used to it in the South.
In an interview on BFM TV in October of 2020, he spoke highly of the IHU, saying that his own mother had recently been treated for COVID at the hospital and that he had no regrets for his support of Raoult because he hadn't killed anyone.
You're discovering him, but I have known him forever. Well, when you go to the IHU, you come out alive, right? So every time you are hospitalized at the IHU, there are no deaths there. I give you a very specific example. My mother, 93 years old, caught COVID 15 days ago. Well, she was treated, she is cured, she's in great shape. There are no deaths at the location. In Professor Raoult's unit, there are things. There are no deaths in the... Yes, but fortunately...
overall, the fact of having said no, minimizing, no regrets.
He did not downplay. No, he did not downplay. He assumed a number of strategic choices, particularly regarding the care that everyone contests. Very well, they contest him, but don't. He has killed no one.
We've done a lot of things we're not proud of. Robbing graves, plundering the tombs, double parking. But nobody got hurt. Well, maybe somebody got hurt, but nobody we knew.
Despite the fact that, arguably, he did, in that famous HCQ COVID study. Musselier's support continued, albeit more cautiously, in another interview the following October, describing the criticisms against him as a Raoult hunt.
Despite everything that is written, the hunt for Raoult continues very well.
Hunting Raoult, honestly?
No, you have read the... Actually, I will. It's the Raoult hunt, but I will proceed differently if you wish. But the first question is to tell me if I support Raoult. Yes, Raoult. I support him a lot, and I will never let him go.
National Rally, a right-wing populist and nationalist rally senator, Stéphane Ravière, bequeathed the scholar the nickname of Raoultrix, our druid, and the National Rally vice president, Jordan Bardella, described the scientist as politically incorrect, relating Raoult to his own party, saying, quote, he may be to medicine what we are to politics.
Didier Raoult, he is the medically incorrect. There, he may be to medicine what we are to politics, that is politically incorrect.
A rather devastating self-condemnation of the party of Marine Le Pen, who, as a then presidential aspirant, was spotted as having one of those little figures of Raoult in her own nativity display in 2021.
Christmas, this holiday, which is of course the religious celebration of the birth of Jesus Christ. But beyond that, for all French people, and in a cultural way, it is a break in the whirlwind of life.
When questioned, she told the press that she bought it precisely because he was the subject of critique, stating that the, quote, unanimity against him is unfair. I don't like lynchings. This form of hypocrisy makes me sympathetic. Clearly, Raoult had friends and admirers in high places outside of just academia. Returning to our story more generally, particularly after the legal threats made against Miss Beek, Schneider, and Samuel, including a public declaration on the IHU's website published in June of 2021, accusing Miss Beek, Schneider, and Barber of harassment, for which the authorities would be contacted, a statement later removed from the site, and which Schneider believes to have been written by Raoult himself, personally, the IHU simultaneously came under fire in 2021 when a total of 38 papers were found to have been published using the same ethical protocol, N 2016-011, approved, as the name implies, in 2016, yet still being utilized as proof of ethical approval in papers published as recently as 2019. This reuse of a single protocol was investigated and reported on by Victor Garcia upon discovering a 2017-2018 doctoral thesis published under the stewardship of Dr. Jean-Christophe Lagui of the IHU that claimed the organization had provided ethical approval for its study of human subjects, including children. There are 39 committees for the protection of individuals in France that are certified to validate research involving human subjects, let alone involving vulnerable human subjects, such as children. The IHU is not amongst them and never has been, nor is it likely to become one anytime soon. In other words, they gave themselves permission to do something that the Foundation did not possess the authority to do.
You're not going to slaughter that pig here, are you?
Not to worry. I have a permit.
This just says I can do what I want.
Amongst the list of 38 papers, all studying vastly different subjects in different populations, a total of 8 studies were conducted on children or explicitly on newborns. Given that none of the 38 made any mention of validation from such an agency capable of approving research on human subjects, none of the papers submitted under that 2016-11 protocol should have been conducted. Additionally, 4 studies began data collection in 2015, before the protocol was even approved by an organization without the power to grant such approval. Given that the same ethical protocol could not possibly be both retrospectively and prospectively applied to studies conducted both before and after 2016, this single, invalid IHU protocol, under the directorship of Didier Raoult, had effectively been used to bypass the normal ethical review process across 38 papers, all long before COVID. You know, back when our biggest concern was the death of a gorilla. Rest in ape heaven, king. As more and more people continued to investigate Raoult's work, those 38 papers using the same invalid ethical protocol grew to 49, on which Raoult was a co-author of 48. In response, the French National Drug Safety Agency, ANSM, launched their own investigation into Raoult and his work, and found, quote, serious shortcomings and non-compliances with the regulations for research involving the human person, which is a nice way of saying unethical human experimentation. This finding from the ANSM directly preceded Raoult's retirement from the IHU in the summer of 2021, and the temporary prohibition of any new human research at the Institute, effectively shutting down the Foundation's main source of fame and fortune. Despite Raoult's departure, a staff member interviewed by Mediapart told them that his presence never left, stating that they believed that, quote, Didier Raoult, the heads of his services, and the heads of branches remained untouchable. But the digging still did not stop there. As in that same time frame, a study conducted by Raoult all the way back in 1993 concerning the identification of traces of trench fever in the homeless and non-homeless population caught the attention of investigators as it also concerned a vulnerable population, the homeless, and did not contain proof of ethical authorization. That really should not be surprising, as Raoult's lack of concern for ethical parachutes began long before COVID, as he himself has stated, and the lack of ethical approval was hand-waved as being not so much research, but standard care, being post facto used as the basis for academic publication. That is, the homeless and non-homeless in this study were already undergoing treatment and were having bloods drawn, as part of the standard procedures of care. Nothing experimental was being done, they were just observing treatment already being administered. The problem with this type of observational analysis is that there is no control group, but we know that nearly 30 years later, Raoult would espouse that as being unnecessary as well. So it's likely that he felt the same way back in 1993.
What started to happen was they just started saying it publicly in front of cameras.
I could propose a new clinical trial, kissing patients on the forehead for 3 days. I would compare those who received the 3 kisses to those who did not survive to receive them. The effect of the treatment would be tremendous. None of the patients who received my treatment would have died.
But the excuse that the data were merely observational quickly falls apart, as both the 1993 publication and a similar study on the homeless published by Raoult in 1999 and conducted in 1997 took additional blood samples from the homeless and non-homeless after being released from the hospital when routine care had ended. Without the ethics approval required for the continued treatment via blood work, Raoult and his team had very arguably broken the law 30 years prior to COVID in the exact same way that they would go on to repeat in the future. According to the head of research at the hospital in response to this finding, quote, "There is no clearly identified instigator for this study. Secondly, at the time, patients included in 1997, the research was established under the Hurriyet-Sarisklot law. The article refers to 250 serum samples taken from healthy donors. According to the publication, these samples would have required the opinion of a consultative committee for the protection of individuals in biomedical research. The positioning of this procedure as standard care is not supported." Meaning, yes, Raoult had conducted this study without the necessary ethical approval. Interestingly enough, the lack of approval was proudly admitted to by one of the co-authors on the 1997 paper, Philippe Broqui, in a snarky response to questions about the paper posted to PubPeer, stating of the work, quote, "There is no protocol, no inclusion criterion, no initial research, question." Ultimately, Raoult did not face any serious legal repercussions, yet, but he was formally reprimanded by the Medical Council of the Order of Physicians Nouvelle-Aquitaine on December 2nd of 2021. While an official reprimand is more serious than a warning, it did not cost Raoult his medical license, again, at least not yet, nor did it translate into any criminal investigation into his work. Again, not yet, although it probably should have. The formal reprimand had, however, damaged Raoult's ego. Despite retiring from the IHU and escaping from any serious punishment, Raoult could not stay out of the spotlight, and in April of 2020, he held a press conference to, quote, defend his honor to the public. Dressed in his iconic lab coat, an act famously known via the Milgram obedience experiment to encourage compliance, which, as it turns out, Raoult was well familiar with, in a lengthy monologue that includes some interesting insights. First, Raoult rightly points out the politicization of medicine in general, and how whether or not a political side supports or is skeptical about vaccines seems to depend significantly on the political environment of a given time, hence why he prefers to find solutions for diseases outside of vaccines. But he also notes that there very well may be a need for a COVID vaccine in those over 60, which, hey, as of May of 2025, was also the exact conclusion reached by the US FDA, and that outside of vaccination in those over 60, opinions on COVID vaccines are swayed by politics, not science. Absolutely ridiculous and unheard of. Politics would never dictate what drugs are considered acceptable. Raoult briefly mentions ivermectin and that it was identified as ineffective due to its similar politicization, and further exemplifies the politicization of HCQ by bringing up the sugary sphere scandal that reported extremely high death rates associated with the use of HCQ as a counterpoint to his own use and study of HCQ in the treatment of COVID. However, he also states that his research on HCQ went on without incident, which we know is incorrect, as once again in his small sample of 26 patients, one had died, 3 required admissions to the ICU, and another died in his second clinical trial. While he does admit that he had been blamed for research misconduct, specifically naming the Order of Physicians, he definitively states in his press conference that his reprimand was over his cantankerous, disagreeable demeanor, for which the Order of Physicians was also guilty. not for his unauthorized testing of HCQ. Raoult spent a significant portion of his nearly 20-minute-long press conference distinguishing himself from other scientists who take money from big pharma firms, while he remains untainted by external funding. Although this is a position long touted as one of the aspects that sets the IHU and Raoult apart from other medical researchers and institutions, despite happily accepting government funds, it also just isn't exactly true. In 2017, when Raoult was being investigated by Mediapart journalists, the internal council at Aix-Marseille that vetted his work was headed by oncology professor Laurence Zitwagel as its president. Until September of 2019, Zitwagel held a 39% stake in a startup company run by her sister, Valerie Zitwagel-Perez, called Everimmune, which frequently partnered with Ermite and the IHU. Raoult himself was a co-founder of Everimmune, but more on that shortly. The 2017 HCERES investigation of Raoult's lab consistently struggled to verify definitive sources of the lab's funding, but found that it had received €909,077 between 2012 and 2017 from various pharmaceutical firms, according to the French Health Ministry. The Institut Mérieux, which controls the multinational biotech company, BioMérieux, had a seat on the board at the IHU and had donated at least €700,000 to Raoult's lab. French big pharma firm Sanofi, again a company on par with Pfizer, Merck, Johnson & Johnson, and AstraZeneca in terms of profits, had also contributed a comparatively minuscule €50,000 to the IHU, according to Mediapart. A search of the website Euros for Docs, which tracks and reports on legally required declarations of interest between medical professionals and pharmaceutical firms, turns up no results for the name Didier Raoult. However, the names of his various foundations and associated groups do appear. As of Mediapart's 2017 investigation, they found that the database only included references to donations to the IHU and occasionally money given in remuneration. Although remuneration for what is not necessarily clear, and that may be due in large part to the IHU's legal designation as a foundation, which allowed it to take private funding up until 2016 when, following an investigation by the French Social Affairs Inspectorate, IGAS, stripped it of its foundational status, a designation given to only 6 public hospital university institutions in the country. According to Euros for Docs, the Institut Mérieux had paid an exact total of €715,077 to the IHU for operational funding and partnership deals, with €165,000 designated for remuneration. When contacted by Mediapart for comment, the Institute responded by insisting that there was no collaboration whatever with Raoult's IHU, and that, quote, as a co-founder of the foundation, and in the framework of a partnership agreement, the Institut Mérieux pledged funds of €125,000 per year for a period between 2012 and 2015, and €25,000 per year for that between 2016 and 2021. The Institute's contact insisted that, quote, this concerns donations and in no case remuneration, despite the designation as remuneration on the Euros for Docs database. They clarified that €165,000 were donated in remuneration to the IHU between 2012 and 2014 to pay for the living and research expenses of a single doctoral student, whose name they did not release to Mediapart, but who was allegedly working in collaboration with Raoult on the study of tuberculosis at the time, research which also will come back later. Doctoral students working at the IHU in 2017 who spoke to Mediapart said that their research grants typically provided them with between €1,000 and €1,400 per month, a far cry from the €165,000 given to the aforementioned doctoral student involved in tuberculosis research, who at an absolute maximum, were his or her living and research costs similar to that of the rest of the cohort over the course of 3 years, would have been €50,400 per annum. So where did the other €114,600 donated to the IHU in remuneration outside of the Institute's yearly donation of €125,000 to the laboratory in general go exactly? When Mediapart reached out to Raoult for answers, they were again redirected to another member of the foundation with a familiar face and name for us, Yolande Obadiah. Obadiah refused to provide any information about the doctoral student or any potential beneficiaries of the remuneration grant due to a, quote, strict clause of confidentiality for all the contracts we sign with industrialists, referring to Mérieux. Similarly, in 2017, Seva, a large French animal health products company, which was researching COVID-19 treatments in 2020, along with the rest of the medical industry, and thus had reasons to continually be invested in Raoult's work, gave 144,000 euros to the IHU, according to Euros for Docs. When questioned about this money, Obadiah said that it was for doctoral grants for the lab's students, but did not provide any further details for the same reasons of confidentiality she gave for Mariu. What Obadiah was willing to divulge to Mediapart was the amount that bioMérieux donated to the IHU annually, 1.2 million euros out of the department's total operating budget of 120 million euros, the majority of which, 60%, is financed by the French Agency for National Research, ANR. She also defended Mariu's position on the board as appropriate, similar to a government body having such a position on a medical board, stating that having a, quote, founder and in the governance of the foundation is a necessity for the IHU, whose objective is to have a global strategic vision of all of the actors who are involved in the field of research, healthcare, and the treatment of patients. She further clarified that the Board of Governors is comprised of 17 members, the Institute's 5 founders, the Mariu Institute, 2 teaching researchers, and 10 other qualified figures, which includes former French health minister and another familiar face, Philippe Douste-Blazy. Douste-Blazy was again a vocal public proponent of the use of HCQ in the treatment of COVID, but by this point seemed to have had something of a change of heart, as in October of 2021 he made an appearance on the news show Public Senate after being named as essentially a co-conspirator of Raoult's, saying he didn't regret said support for HCQ and instead insisted that the mistake was not his, but Raoult's, and the Chinese scientists whose work was used as a justification for Raoult's own.
The CNRS Ethics Committee has published an opinion on the ethical dimension of the health crisis. The opinion doesn't beat around the bush. It directly and specifically accuses you, along with Didier Raoult and Professor Perron. You are accused of scientific populism.
All studies, retrospective and prospective, show that hydroxychloroquine does not reduce mortality, does not reduce the transition to intensive care, and therefore, in the short term, it doesn't work. One could say it doesn't work, and actually there is the question that all scientists are asking is, it's the Chinese who first demonstrated it. When you give an antiviral, hydroxychloroquine or another, immediately at the beginning of the illness, then you have less virus very quickly in the nose, and that's what happened, particularly in Marseille, which was basically the only hospital that was ready to immediately screen people. It's also Raoult's mistake, not just others.
Do you regret doing that?
No, I regret. Yet that's what you were saying, that it was clumsy to tell the French like that, because they, as we can very well say, they don't have the key themselves on whether or not hydroxychloroquine. On the other hand, the French had the right to say, we don't understand why a Minister of Health prevents doctors from prescribing such a medication. Doctors, they can prescribe the medications they want.
Regarding the 50,000 euros that the IHU received from pharmaceutical giant Sanofi, a representative of the company told Mediapart that the money was for, quote, a research partnership, made during the establishment of the IHU back in 2015. But that doesn't make any sense, as the IHU was established in 2012. When questioned about this inconsistency in the timeline, Mediapart's Sanofi contact replied that, quote, this partnership did not allow for putting in place new therapeutic solutions, adding that, quote, we therefore ceased collaboration with the IHU Mediterranean in 2015, still failing to clarify what the 2015 donation was for, as it could not have been granted as part of the IHU's foundation. In a rare moment of responding to the press, Raoult did answer Mediapart's questions about the Sanofi funds, but he also did not explain the purpose of the funds, and instead objected to the amount, 50,000 euros, correcting them by saying that Sanofi had actually donated 150,000 euros to the IHU, with no explanation as to why the French Health Ministry reported the lower figure. In total, it's difficult to say just how much money Raoult's organization took from Sanofi, but it was clearly tens of thousands of euros from one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies on Earth, which Raoult would later claim in his press conference are unable to contaminate his work with funding, unlike other scientists and labs. It is important to note, however, that Sanofi is a leading producer of chloroquine in France, sold under the brand name Plaquenil. That is, then, one of the big pharma companies that was directly funding the IHU was also set to profit massively were hydroxychloroquine to have become the official treatment for COVID in France, and worldwide. The corporate involvement didn't stop there, as in his legally required declaration of interest made on the French Health Ministry's database in March of 2020, Raoult did not include funding he had received from the Japanese megacorporation Hitachi, best known for making the world shake. While the exact nature of Raoult's work with Hitachi is unclear, he did publish a paper in collaboration between the company and the IHU in 2021 on the detection of bacteria using tabletop scanning electron microscopy. An article from 2019 testing a new Hitachi electron microscope was retracted in February of 2024 after it was discovered that it was among the many papers of Raoult's that reused an existing CPP reference number, 2016-11, necessary to conduct research on human subjects, and thus was in violation of the Declaration of Helsinki. Further, it seems that Raoult served as a consultant for Hitachi according to a conflict of interest declaration in a study using a Hitachi microscope from 2024, co-authored by 6 other scientists who actively work at Hitachi or did as of the time of publication. A similar declaration made in a paper from 2022 on the spread and vanishing of the French COVID-19 variant states specifically that Raoult served as a consultant for Hitachi between 2018 and 2020, and also lists him as a board member of the Eurofins company and the founder of a microbial culture company, CultureTop, founded in 2015. As of January of 2022, Raoult was no longer listed as a board member for Eurofins, a company whose revenue peaked during the COVID years at $6.7 billion in 2021, $1.4 billion of which was attributed directly to COVID, as per the company's reporting. As no archive of the site's board before 2022 is accessible, I cannot say for sure exactly when Raoult stepped down or was removed from his position on the Eurofins board, but in 2021, his own startup, CultureTop, was sold to Eurofins, which, depending on whether or not he was on the board at Eurofins at the time of purchase, may have influenced their decision. That is the definition of insider trading, the kind of thing that would make even most politicians blush. Eurofins and CultureTop are not the only companies that Raoult has a vested or invested interest in. As per Mediapart, Raoult owns shares in a total of 8 startup companies, which allowed them to access the resources of the IHU lab, for which each company agreed to pay the foundation with 5% of their capital in exchange. That is, Raoult partnered the startup companies that he owned with the laboratory that he was director of, benefiting both, but most of all, enriching Raoult, either in wealth or in prestige. The other startups Raoult helped found, as per his CV, are Amikana Biologics, founded in 2007, Gene and Green Tech, 2013, BioSquall, 2014, Arthrobac, 2015, MediHandTrace, 2015, and the aforementioned Everimmune in 2017. Amikana designs, develops, and sells biological tools for drug resistance analysis in diseases such as HIV and HCV, to aid in pharmaceutical development. A 2012 estimate from Dealroom, which is the most recent one I can find, places its valuation between 840,000 and €1 million, and its activity seems to have largely gone quiet between late 2020 and early 2024, during much of the drama surrounding Raoult. Gene and Green Tech develop enzymes to provide sustainable alternatives to conventional antimicrobials and for the decontamination of organophosphorus chemicals. I am unsure of its valuation, but it remains affiliated with the IHU, received support from the ANR, and was acquired by industrial group Proxys Development in March of 2025. Its name also bears a striking similarity to a building in Fallout 4, Green Tech Genetics, but that appears to be a complete coincidence. Or is it?
Another coincidence. I believe in coincidences. Coincidences happen every day. But I don't trust coincidences.
What is not a coincidence is who founded Gene and Green Tech. Our old friend, Eric Chabrier. And Gene and Green Tech's biggest customer, outside of the IHU of course, it's the French Armed Forces, with whom Chabrier held the rank of lieutenant and served at the Armed Forces Health Service Research Center. In fact, Chabrier did not earn his professorship at the IHU due to his intellectual or research prowess, but rather because he was installed into that position by the French Armed Forces. Alexander Samuel speculated that, by subsidizing Chabrier, that the military was also indirectly funding the IHU. BioSquall produces analogs of the antimicrobial squalene, and shuttered its doors in February of 2022 for unknown reasons, perhaps being really bad at triple triad. Arthrobac was a research company that developed treatments for everything from acne to resistant bacteria for instances where conventional treatment was suboptimal, including potentially the treatment of lice with ivermectin, of all things. At least according to Leonid Schneider of For Better Science, citing a comment left on PubPeer. So take that claim with a grain of salt. But either way, it's now defunct. MediHandTrace was a product that tracked nurses' hand cleanliness via stops at antibacterial hand stations using an RFID chip inserted in the shoe. The company appears to have closed down in December of 2020, as per their Twitter page. Further, Everimmune is a biotechnology company with a focus on gut microbiome in the treatment of cancer. In 2023, they raised 3.46 million euros from BPI Finance, an investment bank that also backed Gene and Green Tech, to support a clinical trial, and raised more than 5 million euros from private investors in 2021. Although Raoult is not listed as a founder on Everimmune's website, Laurence Zitwigel is, in a position previously attributed to her sister. Another one of Raoult's startups is Procrame, an abbreviation of Point of Care Raoult Mediterranee, which creates and markets mobile tracking software for laboratories used in calculating contagions, and was co-founded by Pierre Uvis-Levy, a frequent collaborator of Raoult and fellow member of the IHU, as well as businessman Eric Chevalier. In 2020, the company's website presented the types of products sold as, quote, emanating from the IHU, and in another article from Hospitals magazine in that same year, their business reportedly boomed with pandemic profits, with sales exceeding 3 million euros, meaning both Raoult and the IHU similarly benefited from their associations and kickbacks from the company, which for the IHU would have totaled 150,000 euros in that year alone, if the 5% capital share reporting from Mediapart is correct. This success was short-lived, however, as in June of 2024, Procrame declared bankruptcy, for reasons I have been unable to identify. But it is possible that the business was collateral damage during the downfall of Raoult's scientific prestige, as is also potentially the case with the other defunct startups.
Dude, I do not understand. I thought you loved the company.
I do, but not more than money, and I just made a shitload of it.
Eric Chevalier responded to Mediapart's request for comment regarding the involvement of Raoult with the company back in 2020 by stating of Procrame that, quote, the headquarters of the company is in Aubagne, but we are hosted by the foundation of Professor Didier Raoult. We work with his teams to validate a test that allows rapid detection of the current coronavirus. We believe we can offer this to our clients, amongst whom are the cruise company Ponant and the shipping fleet operator CMA CGM, between now and the end of April. Didier Raoult did not respond to Mediapart's request for comment about his stake in Procrame. While several of these companies are now defunct, and were even before the onslaught of COVID controversies, the IHU was receiving hundreds of thousands of euros from the companies affiliated with Raoult, which, outside of the value that his fame alone provided, evidences the very real financial contributions brought into the IHU by a sole scientist, and hence why the IHU would have financial rationales to protect him. As in total, during the peak of Raoult's success, the IHU was bringing in about 500,000 euros per annum from his various startup ventures alone, to say nothing of the funding his name attracted from the French government, which again financed 60% of the IHU. Going back to Raoult's press conference from that lengthy fact check, he expressed shock and dismay that his many complaints against his critics were not being taken seriously, and recounts a story of a young man who supposedly made a threatening phone call to him. He goes on to say that, quote, someone with ill intentions leaked internal patient information from the IHU, including his and his wife's medical information, as part of the harassment campaign. I am unsure of who or what he is referring to in either case, however, as I can locate no media report about the phone calls, and as to the second claim, he could be referring to Fabrice Franck, who would indeed go on to leak internal IHU documents to illustrate how several of their staff had violated the Declaration of Helsinki. But given that Franck's full document was not released until months after this press conference, I cannot say for sure what it is he's referring to here. Whatever and whomever he is referencing, he is adamant that he is being harassed and thereby is justified in taking legal actions, although he is similarly adamant that he does not require personal protection and that he is beloved by the people of France overall. He makes a brief reference to a single study's ethics authorization not being signed off on, but otherwise completely avoids the issue of research ethics. Additionally, Raoult announced that he would be expanding his ongoing litigations to include Mediapart and even the hospital itself, in repayment for its continual protection of him. In August of 2022, the IHU was investigated by the General Inspection of Social Affairs, IGAS, which found that the organization had engaged in the unauthorized conduct of clinical trials in the diagnosis and treatment of tuberculosis, that subject the mysterious doc student was paid huge amounts of money to assist on, and again in vulnerable populations, which concluded that, quote, patients have not received treatment that complies with the current standards and that they may have suffered a loss of chance. They further stated that the behavior engaged in by researchers in this study was, quote, likely to be classified as criminal offenses. And presumably, that includes Raoult. At least one subject in this experiment was a minor, and others were non-French speakers, as well as the homeless, none of whom could have reasonably consented to participation in an experimental medical trial that forewent international recommendations for the treatment of tuberculosis in favor of the experimental testing of off-label drugs, namely sulfadiazine, which according to the National Reference Center for Microbacteria and Microbacterial Resistance to Anti-Tuberculosis Drugs, quote, has no place in the treatment of tuberculosis. So, now we have COVID and tuberculosis. What other diseases has Raoult conducted unethical research on?
It's Markiplier sick in bed with AIDS!
I'm not asking that speculatively, because remember those 4 studies that collected data before the 2016 erroneous IHU ethics protocol could have possibly provided them with approval? Well, those were also placed under the microscope, and one of them, evaluation of self-collected rectal swabs for the detection of bacteria responsible for sexually transmitted infections in a cohort of HIV-1 infected patients, published in 2017, on which Raoult was a co-author, was found to similarly lack ethical approval. As the name suggests, this was a study of STIs in HIV patients collected via rectal swab. Without ethical approval, this study could arguably meet the legal definition of sexual assault, ironic given that it was conducted by a man named Didier, implying there's a Diddyest. If I had a nickel for every time someone named Diddy or Diddy adjacent did some unauthorized bum stuff, I'd have 2 nickels. I wonder who got closer to curing AIDS. Anyway, the study still remains available in the Journal of Medical Microbiology as of June of 2025, albeit with a note that it is part of an ongoing scientific misconduct investigation, which by 2022 now included an additional 248 publications, as another protocol, 09022, had been identified by Fabrice Frank as being used and reused by the IHU, placing the number of papers published by Raoult using such a tactic at just under 300. For reference, the mode number of publications for people with PhDs is 1, their doctoral thesis. Meanwhile, Didier had as many papers under scrutiny as most scholars could ever hope to publish in their entire careers. Outside of the general issue that none of these studies were properly vetted, using the same code across projects, the 09022 protocol was similarly applied to studies that involved vulnerable populations, including another on which Raoult was a co-author, published a year prior in 2016 on gut microbiota in HIV patients in the British Medical Journal. French news outlet Le Point contacted one of the 2016 HIV paper's authors, Yves Slavy, the former president of the IRB-approved INSERM from 2014 to 2018, who told the journalist, quote, nobody, and probably not the ANRS, the French National Agency for AIDS Research, was aware of the local ethics committee at the time. In this respect, there is an ambiguity that certainly misled all of us, especially the supervisory authorities and the ASM. The local was interpreted as the Marseille CPP, and no one imagined that it was an internal CPP at the IHU, whose operating methods we do not know. This information, the local CPP and number of studies, has only recently come to light since the investigations conducted into the IHU, end quote, indicating once again that the IHU had used permissions it did not possess to conduct research on vulnerable populations. This particular study also claimed to have ethical permissions under the ANRS EP55 microgut protocol, overseen by INSERM, which greenlit the project in the Clinical Trials Registry of 2014, and yet the study purports to have started collecting data from subjects as early as 2012, meaning that even so, the study would still have been conducted at least partially without permission. But that doesn't really matter, as INSERM confirmed to Le Point that the 2016 publication also did not have approval under the ANRS EP55 microgut. To summarize, the IHU said it had permission to conduct research on vulnerable human populations from a local ethics authority. But the local ethics authority was themselves a foundation that lacked the actual capacity to approve said research, all of which involves more acronyms than a KMFDM cover band. In typical French fashion, the 3 comments left on this damning Le Point article are unconcerned with the findings, and instead are just complaints that the article was published in English.
Here is a great evil coming. Like, what the fuck? All that Chad is saying is that great evil is the damn French.
By September of 2022, and with mounting evidence of a lifetime of misconduct, the investigation turned criminal, being referred to a prosecutor, and in the same month, the Journal of Clinical Microbiology raised concerns with 6 articles published by Raoult in the outlet, once again as part of an ongoing scientific misconduct investigation. Shortly afterwards, the IHU's new director, following Raoult's stepping down, Edward Fournier, who was a co-author on some of those clinical microbiology papers, made a public statement regarding the investigations into Raoult's work, stating that the foundation had, quote, ensured that all ongoing clinical trials involving human person research, HIRP, are suspended pending the regularization of the situation, end quote. But that suspension in September came months too late to comply with WHO mandates. In December, just in time to break out the Raoult nativity figures, PLOS ONE flagged another 49 papers published by the IHU between 2010 and 2020, 48 of which were co-authored by Raoult, and each with the same unclear boilerplate text, quote, this article has been identified as one of a series of submissions for which we have concerns about the reported research ethics approval information, and the article's adherence to PLOS research ethics policies. Despite being embroiled in numerous legal proceedings, including his case against Dr. Beek and now with the French government, Raoult was apparently so unfazed that he proceeded to submit a preprint to medRxiv in April of 2023, once again on the subject of hydroxychloroquine in the treatment of COVID in a massive sample of over 30,000 participants, and conducted between the 2nd of March of 2020 and the 31st of December 2021, which concluded that early or late administration of a combination of hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin provided protection against COVID-related death. However, recall that all research on HCQ and COVID was placed on indefinite pause by the World Health Organization following the retraction of Dr. Mayra's research in May of 2020, meaning that this research had been ongoing long after researchers worldwide had been directed to cease all such work. Either Raoult didn't get the memo, or he felt so invulnerable that he could metaphorically spit in the face of not only his critics, but the entire international medical community, with his brazen disregard for ethical practices. It seems unlikely to be the former, as Raoult clarified that he chose to continue to administer HCQ to patients even after the declaration from the WHO as an off-label treatment. Additionally, this study too was not approved by a registered CPP, but instead by the IHU's Ethics Committee, which once again has never had the capacity to validate such research. The absolute audacity of this man to come out of retirement to commit in one fell swoop every single previous infraction of which he had been accused. And he did it on over 1,000 times the scale of the population as he had in the initially inciting COVID HCQ research. In May, outraged by Raoult's audacious behavior, pharmacologist Matthew Mollimard published a scathing op-ed in Le Monde describing the medRxiv publication as, quote, the largest wild therapeutic trial known to date. He likens Raoult's research to that of Bernard Fortillion, a researcher who conducted an experiment on patients with Alzheimer's and Parkinson's without ethical approval in 2019, leading to his arrest in December of 2020 after over a year of being wanted by the authorities. While on the lam from the law, Fortillion participated in Hold Up, a documentary posted online in November of 2020 before being widely deleted for misinformation, in which he stated definitively that the French Pasteur Institute was responsible for the creation of COVID-19.
By whom was it made?
Everything was made by the Pasteur Institute.
his segment of the documentary appears to have been cut from its official English release for the short period of time that the documentary was available on sites such as YouTube. Following his arrest, Fortillion was imprisoned in a psychiatric hospital for doing to 350 people what Raoult had just done to more than 30,000. Raoult's own losses were piling up, however, as in November of 2022, he lost his court case against Elizabeth Beek, and she has continued her work, commenting on scientific papers ever since. In February of 2025, Dr. Beek's hard work and the many troubles that she endured in her pursuit of academic truth truly paid off, as she was granted the Einstein Award for her achievements in bolstering scientific integrity, which comes with a $200,000 prize. Rather than taking the money all for herself, she instead used it to establish the Elizabeth Beek Science Integrity Fund in partnership with the scientific retraction blog, Retraction Watch, to finance a sleuth in residence position at the outlet, contributing not only her time and effort, but now also her money to the international community of data sleuths. In January of 2023, Aix-Marseille University closed its 7-month-long investigation into 8 of Raoult's papers, 7 of which were ultimately retracted, but refused to release their findings of their investigation to the public, simply declaring the matter closed. Unfortunately for Aix-Marseille, Raoult had made many enemies over the course of the past few years, and one of them, Fabrice Franck, with unique reasons to be furious with the university's handling of the case and the behavior of Raoult and his colleagues, specifically Audrey Calvo, published the findings himself. I mean, they did imply he was a nonce, not exactly the best way to make friends. These findings were that, in addition to Raoult, Jean-Christophe Lagui, Philippe Broqui, Philippe Gautret, Michael Drancourt, Philippe Parola, Matthew Million, Jean-Marc Rollin, and Raoult's replacement as IHU director, Pierre-Edouard Fournier, had in fact breached the Declaration of Helsinki. That pesky little set of rules for scientists that Audrey Calvo mistakenly believed protected herself and others from prosecution. The specific rule of the DOH that these scholars were found to have violated derives from the ethics principles for medical research involving human subjects adopted in 1964 and found in paragraph 23, that stipulate any such protocol, quote, must be submitted for consideration, comment, guidance, and approval to the concerned Research Ethics Committee before the study begins. The 1975 revision of the DOH further clarified the necessity of obtaining ethical approval before research begins, meaning that these statutes were long on the books, long before Raoult earned his doctorate of medicine in 1981. But as we have seen, this guideline was repeatedly and flagrantly violated by Raoult and his cohorts at the IHU, who reused old protocols or simply never even bothered with obtaining ethical approval in the first place. Following the op-ed's publication, 14 scientific bodies, including the National Coalition of Ethics Committees and the French Society of Pharmacology and Therapeutics, signed Mollimard's letter of concern, and in June 2023, the ANSM announced an investigation into the medRxiv paper. Despite being retracted from medRxiv, Raoult's HCQ preprint was formally published in New Microbes and New Infections in October of 2023. Where it remains available and without retraction or even mention of Franck et al.'s bombshell investigation as of June of 2025. Before that, in August of 2023, the total number of publications in question conducted by the IHU reached 456 papers spanning 85 journals, including the 248 that used the same protocol reference number and 39 that lacked a reference number altogether. As Franck et al. 2023 illustrated in a review of the IHU and Raoult's work published in Research Integrity and Peer Review. A single journal, the aforementioned New Microbes and New Infections, had published 180 articles with, at best, dubious ethical approval. Further, at least one of these papers was conducted in 2016, after the implementation of Jardy's Law, which prevents the conduct of human research without an ethics committee approval, which we know the IHU was incapable of providing, and the authors found that the total number of unethically conducted research papers included 78 studies specifically on children.
Jesus Christ!
The authors of this work were unable to even locate the original 09022 protocol document despite requests to the French government, and were instead left with only an outline, providing almost no information as to how this single approval could possibly have applied to hundreds of papers. You may have noticed that an update was made to Frank et al.'s report, which was added in May of 2025 to clarify a potential confound, not with their investigation, but due to Raoult subsequently seeking legal action against two of its authors, Alexander Samuel and Lonnie Besancon. Back in October of 2023, two publications on which Raoult was an author were stricken from Science Reports, an imprint of Springer's Nature journal, one of the most esteemed academic journals in the world. One titled Increased Gut Redox and Depletion of Anaerobic and Methanogenic Prokaryotes in Severe Acute Malnutrition, published in 2016, was retracted due to an inability of the researchers to provide documentation from an ethics committee in either Niger or Senegal where the study was conducted. And the other, Culturenomics and Amplicon-based metagenomic approaches for the study of fungal population in human gut microbiota, published in 2017, similarly for its inability to provide proof of ethics committee approval to conduct human research in subjects in Algeria, Saudi Arabia, and Niger. And although the authors did possess approval in France, it was approval through the IHU, which could not have approved such a study even in France. In December of 2023, New Microbes and New Infections, that journal that published more of Raoult's and the IHU's work than any other outlet, opened an internal investigation into the many papers in accordance with the Committee on Publication Ethics, COPE, guidelines, appropriately titled given the amount of virulent coping surrounding Raoult's endemic work across French biological research. By August of 2024, the investigation into almost 200 papers published in this sole journal was handed over from New Microbes to the Expertise and Scientific and Ethical Integrity Unit of Aix-Marseille as part of their own ongoing internal investigation. That is, the investigation into the journal itself was handed from said journal, heavily compromised by Raoult, over to the university, also heavily compromised by Raoult. Brilliant. In March, Science magazine journalist Kathleen O'Grady published a partial timeline of events as well as comment from several of the involved parties, including Lonnie Besancon, who said regarding his ongoing litigation with Raoult, quote, "I was raised in a really bad neighborhood. You know when you see cars burning in France? That's where I was. I had to stand up for myself, to learn not to be afraid of potential bullies," end quote. Beek similarly commented to Science magazine regarding her own potential future legal actions that, quote, "I don't really have a career he can ruin. I'm not going to let him silence me." But silencing voices of dissent, the scientific world would soon learn, was par for the course for Raoult and his colleagues at the IHU, as revealed in another bombshell article published by Victor Garcia in L'Express in November of 2024 regarding the latest report from the IGAS. This 559-page-long, still incomplete report, but most recent as of the time of this writing, described the work environment of the IHU as being one of harassment, leading to workplace distress, medical prescriptions being made against public health code, responsible for the publication of studies of poor quality or without ethical authorization, and financial mismanagement. But now also included additional details, including testimony from a hospital employee who claimed that a computer was thrown at her by a member of the IHU management. I wonder who that could have been.
Hacks!
The report also included testimony that a professor affiliated with the IHU had instructed his medical students to freeze their sperm before getting vaccinated. The report found that the IHU's goals were, seemingly, to produce as many papers as possible, regardless of their quality. Further, investigators noted that Raoult's use of sulfadiazine and myclocycline in the treatment of tuberculosis in Africa, leading to numerous adverse events, was also potentially criminal in nature, to which Raoult responded by citing hypothetical and non-clinical research as an excuse.
There, Raoult defends himself over several pages. He cites numerous scientific studies, but the IGAS inspectors respond that the studies he cites are often experimental or hypothetical. So to achieve a sufficient level of proof, they tell him he should have conducted a clinical trial in accordance with ethics and the law.
And we know that the Marseille Institute has often taken liberties concerning ethics and the law.
Unfortunately, yes. The IGAS also notes facts that could lead to criminal charges.
And although he did admit that the inclusion of a minor in the tuberculosis research was an accident, he insisted that an interpreter was present when patients consented to the study, to ensure that the subjects provided informed consent to participate. However, no interpreter officially signed said forms. In his response to the investigation, Raoult objected to the use of anonymous testimonies, of which over 300 had been given in this case. He similarly demeaned the investigators as non-experts, incapable of understanding his research, which, to be fair, they were not. But what they were experts in was the legal and ethical compliance elements of research, for which so much of Raoult's work was clearly lacking, to put it lightly. While all of this was going on, Raoult was posting videos to his YouTube channel, sometimes purely about science, but other times these videos were little more than scathing screeds against his critics, including this now unlisted video comparing the news outlets covering his story to Je suis partout, a Nazi publication, and journalists to dogs. Broken clock and all that.
I don't want to say at all that people who work in the media are dogs, not at all. I'm going to talk to you about dogs and information, even though there are currently newspapers or journalists who resemble those who have an idea of war, like what was written at the end of the war in Je suis partout. I recommend you check that out, but there are articles that come up that look a lot like that, and it doesn't bother me more.
In another unlisted video, he continues along these same themes, comparing himself and his perceived persecution to that of Jews, homosexuals, and gypsies, who were ousted from academia in Nazi-occupied France, playing on the sympathy that most people have for such groups in such an instance. Well, except the gypsies, of course.
It was Bertolt Brecht, as the one who deciphered the best, the earliest, everything related to the Nazi approach. He wrote a play called Roundheads and Pointed Heads, in which he explains this time, so he doesn't talk about a specific population, of all those who will be ostracized, then exterminated, the Jews, but also homosexuals, but also the gypsies. It explains how it starts, that is to say, how this population is marginalized, how they are ostracized, meaning how they are seen as different, awful, not integrated into society, and as people who are strange. The first thing that was done was to say, listen, it's in public jobs. Jews no longer have the right to a certain number of public jobs, particularly university teachers. So starting from October, the rectors were tasked with organizing an operation to prevent Jews from teaching.
Once again, I am aghast by the absolute audacity of this man, who conducted unauthorized experiments on children, homosexuals, and those unable to consent due to language barriers, to paint himself as the victim. Given Raoult's use of the COVID epidemic as a convenient opportunity to skirt the ethical boundaries of science, all while being publicly celebrated and even deified, flagrant disregard for ethical protocols, and his seeming obsession with the Second World War, for example, referring to Elizabeth Beek in his book COVID-19 War Diaries as a crow or a scavenger, Nazi collaborators who stole art owned by French Jews, perhaps the Mengele de Marseille is a more appropriate nickname for Dr. Raoult than the French Fauci. When Raoult received a reprimand for misconduct by the Order of Physicians in December of 2022, he said with relief, "I can continue doing my job," despite the fact that he had already retired.
What an odd thing to say.
But even that would no longer soon be the case, as nearly 2 years later, on October 3rd of 2024, Didier Raoult was banned from practicing medicine for 2 years, beginning after the new year, with a representative of the medical council, Gilles Meunier, saying that the original punishment was, quote, too lenient given the violations committed. Given that Raoult had stepped down from his position at the IHU and was already de facto retired 2 years prior to this ruling, it was largely symbolic, a Pyrrhic victory for those whom Raoult relentlessly attacked in the press and the courts, not only of the law, but also of public opinion, for the previous 4 years. After all, it was not Raoult's flagrant violations of research ethics conducted in vulnerable populations without approval, the things that concerned so many people, including Dr. Elizabeth Beek, Leonid Schneider, and many others, that ultimately cost him his positions of power and privilege. It was his staunch advocacy for hydroxychloroquine, which became the subject of politics, not of science. Raoult was punished not for his actions in a vacuum, but because the period of COVID exception was over. On December 17th of 2024, now long after public concern with COVID had hit its peak and quietly rolled back, the high watermark of one of its many associated scandals, the use of hydroxychloroquine left on the scientific community by the paper Hydroxychloroquine and Azithromycin as a Treatment of COVID-19, was officially scrubbed from the academic record, being retracted from the International Journal of Antimicrobial Agents. Montmaillard celebrated the long-fought victory retraction by saying, quote, 4 years for this, when it should have been retracted in the first month. Finally. We've known for about 10 days the study would be retracted, but nothing was being announced publicly. I didn't expect them to acknowledge all the scientific and ethical misconduct we had identified. Thus, after 5 years of lawsuits, conflict, and controversy, in February of 2025, Didier Raoult began his 2-year ban from the practice of medicine. Unfortunately, even if symbolic, this temporary ban has also done nothing to stop Raoult from using his name and legacy to sell something, whether it be medical treatments, prestige, or products. As just earlier in the month, on December 3rd of 2024, a post from a novel anti-aging cosmetics company, Magnificence, was made to Instagram, promising a, quote, molecular innovation that redefines the boundaries of science. You know, like unethically experimenting on 30,000 people. Their website proudly proclaims Raoult as a co-founder, along with cosmetics entrepreneur Nina Basri. Raoult briefly mentioned his involvement with the startup in a video posted to his YouTube channel, but it has since been deleted. Most curiously, perhaps, of this departure from medical startups is that it appears that Magnificence products will include chloroquine as a component, with their website stating, quote, studies have shown that the topical application of chloroquine is effective in reducing or eliminating mites in affected areas of the skin. Despite his dedication to HCQ costing him his very ability to practice medicine, it seems that dedication is unwavering. But whether said dedication is because the drug has become so thoroughly tied to his own personal brand, or because he genuinely believes it to be some sort of panacea, I cannot say. Either way though, Raoult is still selling his name, and the name of chloroquine, now not as a cure for COVID, but as snake oil for aging women. Didier Raoult once achieved pseudo-mythological, nigh deific status as a scientific savior during the COVID crisis. And despite his long and storied history as a medical maverick, as is so often the case, his star fell from the public eye just as quickly as it rose during the peak of the pandemic. While I have no doubt that Raoult will continue to profit from his many financial ventures, particularly perhaps amongst those who believe that HCQ was an elusive elixir being intentionally hidden from the people, due to the fact that it very much was barred from being researched and administered for a time in connection to COVID, Raoult's story serves as a rather perfect and poetic exemplar of the opportunism the pandemic state of exception represented. Already a man with little concern for medical ethics, Raoult took advantage of the laxed COVID standards to position himself as humanity's salvation, bringing us back from the brink of destruction with a simple, effective, and cheap little pill. Although we have examined many of Raoult's behaviors in the years since and leading up to the publication of that now infamous HCQ paper, who exactly is Didier Raoult? In June of 2021, Ariane Chemin, a journalist who had previously penned a biography of President Emmanuel Macron's chief bodyguard, Alexandre Benalla, and criminal affairs journalist Marie-France Eschquan, published a biography of Raoult subtitled A French Madness. I cannot speak French, small mercies. For this video, I have relied on Google Translate, DeepL, and ChatGPT for comparative translations of many articles and reports that are exclusively in French. And while that works for relatively short documents, I don't think it works great for entire books. You may have also noticed that many of the quotes I have read verbatim in this video have not aligned one-to-one with the text on the screen, which was my intentional attempt to get at the meaning behind someone's words by using more than one translation source. As such, I am relying on an English language report on the book by Alexander Samuel with comments from Magali Carcopino-Tussoli, published in For Better Science, as a source for much of the following information. I do have an ebook version of Un Folie Français that I have similarly used AI to translate only to confirm the claims made by Samuel about its contents. However, as I have covered, neither Samuel nor Carcopino-Tussoli, reminder Raoult's own daughter, are fans of the man, and both have their own personal reasons to very much dislike him. But regarding information about his personal life and history, A French Madness with comments from Mag is likely the best source available. Thus, with the caveat that this has been translated through the lens of critics in mind, let's answer that question. Who is Didier Raoult? According to the biography, Raoult was born in Senegal to a famous military physician father, André Raoult. André's early work included the study of correlations between nutrition, intelligence, and, quote, white blood. That's white as in Caucasian blood, not blood cells, in classifying the various ethnicities into different types. Despite frequently portraying himself as a single child to the media, Didier had 5 siblings and allegedly even owned a pet antelope while growing up in Senegal. After leaving his mother, Raoult's father assisted in the development of superamine, a healthy alternative to dried milk as a nutrition supplement in Africa, where clean water is a rarity. However, superamine requires water to prepare it, rather defeating the point. Although his parents never divorced, Didier recalls in his biography that his mother had an affair with famed French writer Henri de Monterland, seemingly writing personal fanfiction to tie himself to a different famous French figure outside of André. Despite stating that his parents were told by a child psychiatrist that he would have an IQ of 180, although he elsewhere claimed it was 130, when Didier was 17 or 18, he was a self-professed anarchist, and temporarily forewent forwarding his education by sailing around the world, which in reality meant working as a deck boy on a cruise liner, requiring his parents to fund his return to France when he ran out of money. Similarly, his collegiate studies were financed by his father, but Raoult did not appear to have an early passion for medicine, as his baccalaureate degree, which he completed in 1972, was in literature. When he did switch to medicine in his later studies, his work was far from exemplary, and he seems to have chosen to focus on neglected infectious diseases because he performed poorly during his medical internship. Not that it prevented him from making waves early on in his medical career, however, as in some of his earliest work on Mediterranean spotted fever, a relatively mild disease, Raoult detected the first fatal case amongst a group of 40, and then identified an additional 6 fatalities. What a coincidence. Someone might want to look into that one, huh? Maybe they just all developed secondary lead poisoning. He made fast friends with many influential people both during and following medical school, including Michelle Rubirola, who called the man macho and was elected mayor of Marseille in 2020 for the Left Green Party. She even called for a Marseille-specific scientific council to be staffed by Didier Raoult, in opposition to Macron's National Scientific Council. Raoult also met his later ally, Yolanda Obadiah, who was co-leader of the IHU with Raoult when she was still just a student, and an abortion activist. On the opposing political side of the aisle, Raoult befriended Maurice Toga, a right-wing MP who served as president of the University of Marseille in 1989, and Renard Muselier, who served as a spiritual successor to Toga in Alpes-Côte d'Azur, and was an ardent supporter of Raoult during the HCQ scandal. When he was 28, Didier married psychiatrist Natasha Kane, and the two briefly lived in the US, with Raoult taking a position at the National Institute of Health, while his wife tested MDMA on monkeys at the Walter Reed Army Medical Center. Sometime after returning to France, Toga helped secure Raoult a professorship at Aix-Marseille University, of which Raoult would quickly become the president. Didier allegedly used his fixation on H-index scores to flatter others, and again form friends both on the left and the right, including Claude Grasselli, an affiliate of right-wing President Jacques Chirac, and Claude Allègre, a geochemist and left-wing Minister of Education and Research. In both 2011 and 2015, Grasselli granted Raoult the distinction of Officer of the Legion of Honor and Commander of the Order of Merit. He also made friends with Valérie Pécresse, who would become the Minister of Research and Education under center-right Republican President François Fillon. Raoult's ego extends beyond his scientific career, bragging in the book that even at the age of 69, nice, he could still bench 140 kilos. Yeah, I certainly believe that this James May meets Jimmy Savile looking dude can bench something approaching the world record for a man his age, set by Jack Malley in 2023 at 162.6 kilograms. Don't you? Similarly, Raoult has stated that he is 1.9 meters tall, or 6'2", but his daughter refutes this claim, saying he's 1.8 meters, 5'9", which one can compare in photos of him standing beside Emmanuel Macron, who stands at 175 centimeters, or 5 foot 7.4 inches. Does any of this matter? No. Is it funny? Oh yes. Mag further confirms claims of Didier's narcissism, mentioning that he also owns a marble bust of himself in the style of a Roman emperor. And Raoult really does seem to be a legendary figure deserving of a marble bust in his own personal recount of his life, recalling how, during the Rwandan genocide, he hopped on a plane to treat typhus, saving thousands of lives abroad, and similarly saved the Briançon commune back in the Alpes-Côte d'Azur region by treating Q fever there with, of course, hydroxychloroquine, following in the footsteps of fellow Frenchman Paul Facette, who helped develop the first vaccine for Q fever in the early 1970s. After his discovery of the Mimi virus in 2011, Raoult was granted his own department within the university, the IHU, by then President of France, Nicolas Sarkozy. Before the construction of the IHU in 2013, Raoult threatened a CGAPS strike in protest of the project being blocked by INSERM and the CNRS. CGAPS is an academic evaluation tool similar to the H-index. By threatening to stop publishing and limiting his CGAPS score, Raoult was essentially threatening to limit funding to medical research that his paper mill of publications produced. Then Higher Education Minister Geneviève Fioraso sided with Raoult over INSERM and the CNRS, allowing the IHU to go ahead unimpeded. Raoult appeared to never be able to take no for an answer, which is likely why when he finally did get his IHU, he surrounded himself with yes-men, generals in his army, many of whose names we've already heard before, including Michael Drancourt, Raoult's biggest fan, who named the bacteria genus Rutella in his honor upon discovering it in 2001, Philippe Broqui, Philippe Parola, Bernard Davost, and Eric Chabrier. However, it seems that Raoult may have spent too much of his political capital in securing the IHU to continue playing both sides so easily, as only a few of his allies were present for his inauguration as the Foundation's director in 2016. Local politicians and close friends were present, yes, but not people like Agnes Buzyn, the Minister of Health, or Frédéric Vidal, the then Minister of Higher Education. Continuing on with the creation of his cabal of cronies, after the establishment of the IHU and with Raoult as its director, both his old friend Dosplazy and Fioraso, who had secured the department for Raoult, joined its administrative board. Raoult's friendship with Dosplazy was so close that he even advocated for Blazy to be made into the head of the WHO in 2017, which seems that it may have been an attempt to gain control over the WHO, given Raoult's negative stance on the organization otherwise, which he has described as pyromanic in its tendency towards overreaction in the book. I will let Dosplazy's own stated plans for what he'd do as leader of the WHO speak for themselves.
I will tell ministers of health that the economic cost of violence against women and children is a high burden for most countries. If violence against women and children is not adequately addressed, the financial drain on the health system, counseling and other related services, the justice system, child and welfare support, as well as indirect costs such as lost wages, productivity, and potential, will undermine a country's ability to reduce poverty. As such, violence against women and children is a clear barrier to sustainable development.
The internal issues at the IHU were so pervasive, even a few years after its founding, that in 2017, students performed a rendition of It's Raining Men, titled It's Raining Shit, that extols the many problems at the university hospital, obviously well known to its students, if not the broader public. The song makes some allusions to events of which I have no reference. For example, saying that Andreas Stein, a member of the IHU and frequent collaborator of Raoult's, had headbutted someone. Perhaps Raoult, but far more likely Eric Guigo. Jean-Paul Casalta is also mentioned by name, and is another member of the IHU who apparently had a reputation as something of a kiss-ass, as per the lyrics, but I can also find no further information to evidence that claim either. But the song does corroborate Mag's claim that Raoult owns a Romanesque bust of himself. Other aspects that would take years for the rest of the world to be made aware of, namely that the IHU was a paper mill that arguably used its students, both foreign and domestic, to fuel the perpetual flow of papers, are present in the musical number. The primary subject of the song, however, is the issue of sexual harassment and assault, which makes sense as in 2017, Eric Guigo, a researcher at the IHU, was dismissed by the CNRS following allegations of assaulting female students at the university hospital. In July of 2022, Guigo was formally sentenced to 18 months in prison, including 6 months under electronic monitoring for harassment, both moral and sexual, and the sexual assault of 2 female students at the IHU. Choice quotes of the moral and sexual harassment include, quote, "Okay girls, it's 4 p.m, time for a blowjob. Who's up for it? You're lovely, you'll have to get under the desk." And, quote, "I've never slept with a pregnant woman." Understandably, the female students at the IHU in 2017 were particularly enraged that this behavior had occurred under the great Didier Raoult's watch. So, let's watch it.
Laisse flotter ton amour, viens dans ta tour des Babel, le temple du quotidien, et tu la fais en ciel. Il pleut la mer, sur la cime, il pleut la mer, la paix. Oh, il pleut la mer, sur la cime, il pleut la mer, la paix à mer, mais la paix à suivre, on te sauve la flaque. Loué, fan bandit, devant son buffet, ferme-toi. Mais son nom en premier, dans sa taille comme Canada, les matos sexy, ton amour s'éclate, et conduit ta mère dans les médias, ma route est en galère. Il pleut ta mer.
In 2018, after ending the IHU's affiliation with INSERM and the CNRS, INSERM director Yavis Levy changed the IHU's status from a foundation to a, quote, group of public interest in the midst of investigations into the organization's funding sources, which significantly limited its sources of private funding and meant greater oversight from the university hospital upon the IHU. By the end of the 2010s, Raoult's reputation was far from what it had once been within the French medical community. But COVID presented an opportunity to not only make a greater name for himself, but to make it a household one. Before the novel virus had spread outside of China, Raoult started making videos about it on his YouTube channel, ensuring viewers that it was nothing to be concerned about, and criticizing the WHO for those aforementioned pyromanic tendencies, merely overreacting to the situation. Despite publicly stating that COVID was no big deal, behind the scenes, Raoult seemed to recognize it as a major medical concern, or perhaps more importantly, as the key to rebuilding his reputation. Because in January, when the SARS-CoV-2 genome was first published, the IHU bought or borrowed as many collection swabs, thermocycling machines, chemical reagents, and nucleotide probes and primers as they could get their hands on, spending €500,000 on new machines alone, according to the New York Times. How could Raoult have possibly guessed that COVID would become such a major health crisis? Could it possibly have been through the telephone of his friend Douce-Blazy? I'm just asking some questions. Raoult was obviously eager to jump into the study of COVID, and he got a unique opportunity to do just that on January 31st of 2020, after French expats living in the Hubei province of China were sent back home to France and placed under quarantine in the city of Carry-le-Rouet, only 30 kilometers away from Marseille. Without permission to do so, Raoult sent members of his staff to Carry-le-Rouet to take nasal swabs of the quarantinees, breaching said quarantine. While, in his book, Raoult recalls how his team was prevented from collecting the samples by the General Director of Health, Jerome Salomon, due to bureaucracy, in reality it was the Ethics Committee that prevented Raoult from collecting the swabs because he had no approval from a CPP to do so as per usual. But Raoult was right to purchase all of that equipment, as mere weeks later, the WHO declared a global pandemic. Raoult publicly remained consistent with his previous stance that the WHO was alarmist, raising parallels to previous public health scares with minimal death tolls, including mad cow disease, chikungunya, Ebola, and the H5N1 avian flu. Raoult had actually written a book about the latter, in which he explained that it similarly posed no real risk to the public, but it only sold a few thousand copies, while other French authors who took a more alarmist approach to the avian flu sold tens or even hundreds of thousands. Raoult's then student, Yannis Russell, helped him with filming his YouTube videos, serving as his interviewer in many, and also made several comments to the news media about the IHU study of HCQ on COVID, as well as the Sugary Sphere HCQ debacle. In addition to his interest in the history of medicine, rather than practicing medicine himself, Russell was also running for local office as a member of Macron's LREM party, and was known to Yvonne Berland, a formerly right-wing politician under Jacques Chirac's presidency, who again was one of the political figures who helped secure the IHU's funding for Raoult and continued to support the institute, really just demonstrating how incestuous this entire scenario was from the very beginning, from before the beginning. Not every employee at the IHU was so dedicated to Didier. As one of its members, La Scola, was skeptical about the efficacy of HCQ, and Parola warned that while HCQ is cheap, it's also potentially dangerous, as the drug had been previously used by those seeking to end their own lives as the acting agent of death, stating of HCQ that, quote, "one box and it's over." Despite these words of warning, others were completely behind the renowned physician's hypothesis, including Drancourt, who said that Raoult had taken HCQ himself while growing up in Africa, and had used it effectively to treat Q fever and Whipple's disease. After being called fake news by the outlet Le Monde, Raoult mocked the newspaper by stating, quote, "When I make a video, there are 3 times more people who see it than there are Le Monde readers." And he certainly did have the people's attention, as he was called in by Macron to serve on France's COVID Council before quickly leaving the position. One of his reasons for leaving was the presence of Jean-François Delfraissy, a member of the IHU's board, but also close friends with Yavis Lavie, who had not so long ago stripped the IHU of its foundation status. Another one of his personal enemies, Yazdapana, was also on the council, surely to Raoult's dismay, but his given reason for leaving so abruptly was the inclusion of Michael Jolly, the head of the French division of Gilead, which, as we have learned, is not one of Raoult's favorite big pharma companies. No, that appears to be Sanofi. And speaking of Sanofi, the council also consisted of David Lowe, the director of Sanofi. Raoult also disapproved of the inclusion of Arnaud Fontenay and Neil Ferguson, whom he considered to be too alarmist and mathematical in nature. And Raoult tends to not be fond of maths, writing in an article he penned in Le Point in 2015 that, quote, "I, a scientist in a hard science field, don't need to understand the full mathematics behind the tools I use. A few concepts in probability were enough for me. I even avoided math in the final 2 years of high school, with no intellectual damage," and went on to describe mathematics in general as, quote, a colossal waste. What certainly is a colossal waste, at least by my estimate, is not mathematics, but the enormous amounts of time, energy, and money that was poured into the IHU and by extension into Raoult and his ego, not so much of saving the world, but of being celebrated for his genius. And thus, with all of that in mind, let's come to a few conclusions. Over the course of this long video, we have seen how one man and one study, amongst his thousands, sparked a match that lit alight the tinderbox that was the University Hospital of Aix-Marseille in the time of COVID, in a blaze of scandal, cronyism, egoism, medical misconduct, ethics violations, and voracious greed, all tied to that one man, Didier Raoult. Raoult appears to have never had a true passion for science. His true passion appears to be for himself. And as such, he has spent his life weaving his own personal version of how to win friends and influence people, rubbing shoulders with France's elites and lining his pockets in the process. The exceptional period that was the COVID era presented a unique opportunity for an opportunist such as Raoult to transform himself from a prominent figure in the recesses of rare disease research into a towering colossus over the international medical community. And to obtain that status, he violated the doctor's most sacred oath: do no harm, in his haste and self-centeredness. The fact that HCQ does little to treat COVID but also did not cause significantly more deaths during this debacle is the brightest silver lining of this story. As had Didier been right but so embroiled in controversy that HCQ was disregarded erroneously, or had the Sugary Sphere researchers been right but so embroiled in controversy that HCQ was truly dangerous, hundreds, perhaps thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of people could have died. Luckily, HCQ just doesn't seem to do much of anything for COVID. But it was essentially just that, luck, because it wasn't about medicine. It was about money, it was about fame, it was about status, at least for the likes of Didier Raoult. In the prolonged period of time that I spent researching this video, watching hours of lectures, YouTube videos, news appearances, and depositions, and reading countless of his papers, I feel I have gotten a sense of who Didier Raoult is. And while, yes, I believe he is a petty narcissist willing to sacrifice the careers and even lives of others, including the most vulnerable, to benefit himself, I can also understand why it took so long for his house of cards to crumble. He comes off as sincere in his passion for science. The problem is that his passion is not for science, or at least not for science itself, or so I believe, but rather for using science as a mechanism for personal enrichment. That's why, I believe, he was willing to flagrantly disregard research ethics practices, staff his research department with big pharma, friends, and political figures, and file lawsuits against anyone who spoke out against him. Because he does care about medicine, but only insofar as it is beneficial to himself. From a low-resolution view, just catching glimpses into the man's behavior and demeanor in the occasional news piece, sandwiched in between the daily deluge of information and misinformation that was the COVID period, I can certainly see why his actions would appear noble. That he was willing to cure COVID at any and all costs, even that of his career, even that of his experimental subjects. However, when put under the microscope, it becomes clear that this fervor was not for the study of infectious disease, but for himself. Pride comes before the fall. And while I'm sure that Raoult is doing fine financially and will continue to for the rest of his life, coasting on the credibility that his name still imparts in the general public, if not within the medical community, he certainly is prideful, and he certainly did fall from his position of grace. While the average person with a Raoult nativity figure, much like the average person with a Fauci votive candle, both generating dust in storage, probably will never know the truth about the sins of their scientific saviors, the medical and academic record will forever show that Didier Raoult was, yes, a man with a H-index 3 times that of Einstein, and yes, he discovered the Mimi virus, and yes, the Rutella virus bears his name, but his CV is also littered with more retracted papers than most scholars could ever hope to publish over the course of their entire careers. Hindsight is 2020, which is why it's only now, after the period of COVID exception has ended, that we can look back on these events with any clarity. And in 200 years, scholars will look back at Raoult's legacy, unaffected by personal experiences with the COVID crisis, and I believe they will see little more than one of the worst cases of scientific fraud in the history of academia. Or so one must hope. But hey, what do you guys think? Has your faith or trust in scientists changed over time? Do you think that Raoult had good intentions and genuinely believed that HCQ was the cure for COVID? Or was he driven by self-interest and greed? Maybe a bit of both? Do you think that Raoult got what he deserved, or was he not punished enough? Or do you think that he was wrongly persecuted because of the politicization of the COVID pandemic? Let me know what you think in the comments down below, because I genuinely am very curious about what others think about this massive debacle, but also because it does help promote the video in the YouTube algorithm. While you're down there, if you liked the video, be sure to leave it a like and subscribe if you're not already subscribed, and if you really enjoyed the video, to sign up and become a channel member. These videos, as you can imagine, take a long time to research and put together. So if you would like to support my work in making these kinds of lengthy documentaries on topics of science, scholarship, and politics, you can do so by signing up for my Patreon or my Subscribestar to gain access to our Discord, where I preview these videos live with all of you and just hang out in our little nerdy social science community. You'll also see your name at the end of every video along with these fine folks here. If for some reason you want to hear more from me, I do a weekly news and politics podcast on the Broken Crown channel with my co-host Spoon, also linked in the description, along with links to my merch store for social science swag. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, dear friends, Altana Volt.
Degrading conditions, vile behavior. If you believe La Provence, it's better not to be a woman. Leave your dignity behind. Come to his Tower of Babel, the temple of Clostridium and of sexual harassment.
It's raining shit on Latimon. It's raining shit at the AP. Get to work, master students. Get to work, med students. Get to work, foreigners. It's raining shit on Latimon. It's raining shit at the APHM. The perverts at the IHU all caught sex fever. Praise be to the great Didier, bow before his bust. Put his name first, kiss his ring like a salted does. Climatiseptic, the god Rutella, and to talk shit in the media. Raoul is still here. It's raining shit. Worse than his germs, the man is vile.
Everyone hates him. That headbutt from Big Andreas. He really had it coming. It's raining shit. It's raining shit all afternoon. It's raining shit at the AP. It's raining shit all afternoon. It's raining shit at the AP. It's raining shit.